Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of what if Deku had a quirk that could steal powers? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. As per his ritual, Izuku checked both doors to his right, confirmed Bakugo wasn't near despite knowing he wasn't, and ensured his other classmates weren't watching him. Same as a couple minutes ago. Let's see here. Katsuki Bakugo. Their teacher trailed off. Bakugo, you're aiming for UA, right? The classroom erupted into chatter, everyone muttering about Bakugo's likelihood of attending a school with an acceptance rate of 0.2% for its hero course. As his classmates debated, Izuku stayed silent. He prayed their teacher wouldn't mention the other student who had selected UA as his first choice, back when he'd thought submitting the school's name would be enough to motivate him. Well, maybe it was. He wasn't sure whether he would take the entrance exam. If he were accepted, which was unlikely already, would it be worth it to try? He would like to think it was. As Bakugo boasted about how he would become the next All Might, Izuku kept his head down, his eyes trained on the marred surface of his desk. The many carvings of Quirkless had long been scratched out and replaced with villain or thief. Usually, he kept the words hidden under one of his notebooks. But he'd already packed his materials away. Now, he stared at the words with his teeth clenched hard enough to make his jaw sore. Eventually, he forced himself to look away and shifted his arm to cover the worst of the carvings. You're also going for UA, aren't you, Midoriya? Bakugo froze in his position on the top of his desk, which he had jumped onto during his rant about his future as the #1 hero. The haughty grin on his face soon turned into a snarl, with one side of his lips curling up to show his teeth. He looked over his shoulder at Izuku and glared. The rest of the class erupted into whispers among themselves, none difficult to hear. With each comment, Izuku shrank further into himself. His cheeks were growing uncomfortably warm. He hid the lower half of face behind his arms, covering his cheeks while still giving himself a full view of the classroom. Fighting back tears, he could only hope his classmates wouldn't notice. Bakugo jumped down from his desk, so Izuku's head shot up. Izuku had done it quickly, as he was well aware Bakugo would notice and consider it a testament to Izuku's inferiority. Therefore, Izuku might just be able to escape unharmed later. With a scowl and a few mighty stomps over to Izuku's desk, Bakugo slammed a hand down on the scratched surface. An explosion lit up between his fingertips. In a flash, the force of a controlled blast threw Izuku into the wall not far behind his chair. Sparks crackling on his palms, Bakugo leaned forward, glaring down his nose at Izuku as he cowered. He knew Izuku wouldn't try to take his quirk. They both did. Izuku pressed himself against the wall, eyes darting left and right in an attempt to find the easiest escape route despite knowing them by heart. Still, he knew better than to bolt away from Bakugo in such a position. It would irritate him, which would lead to a nastier burn than the one Izuku would receive if he navigated their interaction well. So he bit his tongue, hard enough to hurt but not enough to bleed. He dug his fingernails into the wooden floor. Protecting his face with his hands wouldn't do him any good either, so he didn't. Forget these extras and their crappy quirks. You've got the worst quirk anyone could have. Do you really think you can become a hero? His eyes narrowed. You think you can rub shoulders with me? No matter what Izuku said, no matter what he claimed, Bakugo would think the worst. Bakugo had to know Izuku would never consider himself superior, and yet, for a reason he couldn't fathom, Bakugo never accepted his words. Wasn't it obvious that Izuku was weaker? Yet Bakugo kept asking as if he were waiting for Izuku to challenge him, or as if he needed confirmation that Izuku knew his place. Whatever the reason, Izuku could only speak the truth. The worst reaction to the truth would be better than the worst to any lie he could come up with. I know I can't compete with you, Izuku said, letting his voice shake. His fingernails dug harder into the panels of the floor. I don't think I'm going to, apply to UA anymore. So you've come to your senses. Izuku kept his eyes trained on Bakugo's face, if only to see what fate awaited him. Biting down on the inside of his cheek hard enough to taste the tang of blood on his tongue, he kept his lips pressed firmly shut. Agreeing with Bakugo, while truthful, would lead to another burn scar to match the collection already scattered along his skin. Before Bakugo could say more, their teacher interrupted. Okay, let's calm down, everyone. Bakugo Midoriya, please take your seats. I haven't dismissed you yet. Izuku flinched when Bakugo shot him the most violent scowl he had seen that day. That week even. After a moment that dragged on far too long, Bakugo turned around, heading back to his desk at the front of the classroom. When he'd taken his seat, and his eyes stayed directed forward, Izuku picked himself off the floor quietly. He took his seat in the back. It was the closest seat to the door he'd been able to snag that year. Thumbing over the crude carvings on his desk, his eyes burned with tears that he refused to let fall. To calm himself, he put a hand on his left shoulder and pressed down with the heel of his palm. The action shot pain across his skin. Breathing in deeply, Izuku blinked back his tears and stared ahead, where his teacher was saying something. His hand itched for his latest hero analysis notebook, Hero Analysis for the Future number 13, but he knew better than to leave it in his backpack. It had been years since he last left one in his bag. That day, he'd taken it out to add something during their lunch PRD and Bakugo had burned it between his fingers. He'd found it best to leave it in the safety of his bedroom since then. It wasn't ideal, since writing in his hero journals, usually, never failed to help him de-stress as long as he didn't think of how the effort of writing them could all be for naught. With his fingers dancing along one strap of his backpack and his leg bouncing under his desk, Izuku waited for the bell. If Bakugo called out to him as soon as the bell chimed, he would be forced to stay. Darting out of the room before Bakugo could reach him would lead to a worse scar the next morning. However, on the off chance he didn't say anything, Izuku would take it. And hope that the punishment the next day would be no worse than usual. He rarely forgot, or more accurately, was rarely in a better mood, but Izuku could hope. The bell rang across campus. As Izuku hesitated for half a second, Bakugo snapped, "We ain't done here, Deku." Standing up, back hunched and hands in his pockets as he strolled over, he still loomed over Izuku in his seat. "Don't you effing lie to me. Have you finally learned your place?" Izuku knew exactly what he should do. He should bow his head, nod slightly, and not say a word. So that was what he did. "So you've given up being a hero," Bakugo stated, though he clearly wanted confirmation. Izuku stared at Bakugo's shoes. "I don't think there's a point." "DMN right," he laughed. "All you can ever be is a quirk-stealing villain. But you don't want to be a villain, right? Well, if you really don't want to be a villain, why don't you pray for a decent quirk in your next life and take a swan dive off the roof? Until then, maybe stick to becoming some D-ranked villain sidekick." With that, Izuku bit down hard on his tongue. His mouth filled with the familiar taste of blood once again. He bent his head down, letting the curled strands of his hair hang down and hopefully cover the top half of his face. He watched Bakugo's shoes carefully. If Bakugo was about to strike, his feet would move in a way Izuku was decidedly familiar with. "You know what, that'd be great," Bakugo said. Izuku couldn't see his face. But, if he had to take an educated guess, he'd say Bakugo was tapping his chin with his finger, pretending to consider a new idea. "Don't bother offing yourself. Just make sure to become a villain, and then I can kick your butt when I become a pro." Izuku forced his head up, locking eyes with Bakugo, well aware of his pitiful expression. It was what he wanted to show. It would give Bakugo a feeling of satisfaction that would disarm him. Would make him less likely to use his quirk. And it worked, because the silence dragged on for a moment, and when it had lasted a little too long, Bakugo slammed his hand down on Izuku's desk. Izuku flinched violently backwards. With a laugh, Bakugo lifted his hand and stepped away. Then, as he started towards the door, he said, "It's not even worth burning you." Now alone, Izuku reached down and grabbed his bag with trembling fingers. He let them rest there, eyes on the clock as the second hand ticked by agonizingly slowly. When 10 minutes had passed, and he was confident he wouldn't run into Bakugo or his friends, he heaved his bag up onto his right arm. He positioned it in such a way that he could balance it on the one shoulder. Years of practice made the task easy. The walk back home seemed longer than it had any right to be, but it had been that way for years. So Izuku trudged home, a mantra in his brain. He wasn't a villain. And he wouldn't become one, because his villainous quirk didn't have to define him. But he supposed it could define his career, because how many would be willing to see him as a hero? As he approached the underpass he passed every day, he swallowed hard. His tongue stung as he swiped it under a sharp canine. Focusing on the sting let him regain control of his thoughts, replacing the voice that told him he could never be a hero with the comfort that stemmed from focusing on the pain. The warmth from the sunlight beating down on his face disappeared as he walked into the shade created by the bridge above. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. When he opened them, he was met with the sight of the sewer grate up ahead turning. Immediately coming to a stop, Izuku stared with furrowed brows. It hit a snag only to JRK open. He took a step back. He'd been far too late. A flash of sewer green something barreled in his direction, and Izuku had no time to blink before it was upon him. A mass of sludge coiled around his waist and around his arms, pinning them to his sides as he struggled helplessly. His blunt fingernails tore at nothing. His muscles refused to cooperate. The slime clogged his nose, and his heartbeat started to roar in ears as he opened his mouth, desperate for air. The sludge slithered down his throat. Pain shot through his body, unbearable in a way that promised death. He was going to suffocate. With the last shreds of his consciousness, he forced his fingers to spread, against every fiber of his brain telling him not to. The action sapped the last of his strength. His body gave out and he collapsed. Izuku jerked awake to the sound of someone yelling. Well, maybe not yelling, but definitely talking loud enough to make his head throb. His eyes shot open as he shot 2 fingers to his throat to check his pulse, only to realize both his hand and neck weren't solid. Glancing down, his body was a moving mass of that same slime. His arms and legs were barely discernible. The urge to vomit bubbled up his throat. "Are you all right there, young man?" someone asked, his voice deep, resonant, and awfully familiar. Izuku glanced up, then away when his eyes landed on the figure just above him. Towering over him was the pro-hero that inspired millions, the hero that had saved millions, the hero that Bakugo was destined to become as powerful as. Belatedly, Izuku breathed, "All Might. Glad to see you're okay, young man. You had me worried there. Apologies for getting you caught up in my villain hunt." He glanced back at a man tied up behind him, body lying limp on the asphalt. "But I must ask you, what is your quirk? I almost apprehended you instead of the villain." He motioned towards the man again. Izuku dropped his head, letting the messy strands hide his eyes. He stared at All Might's shoes. He couldn't refuse to answer the symbol of peace, of all people. Still, he wasn't exactly inclined to reveal the one quirk that even All Might might not be able to truthfully say could be heroic. It's the ability to take another person's quirk and use it as your own? Izuku nodded, eyes downcast. He forced his eyes upwards to gauge All Might's reaction, and he couldn't say it was a pleasant one. The pro had a smile on his face as always, but it was tight around the edges. He was clearly unable to think of a response that wouldn't be too harsh. "I know it's a villain's quirk," Izuku said. He tried to smile, but he could feel how awkward and unconvincing it was, so he dropped it. Can I give his quirk back?" "Oh yes," All Might said. He pulled 2 plastic bottles from his pockets, and Izuku wondered how they'd managed to fit, even in his cargo shorts. It was strange seeing him out of his hero costume, but the villain must have caught him during the little time he had to himself. "When he tries to use his quirk, I'll wrestle him into these." Izuku nodded and stood up slowly, unable to suppress the quirk. He shuffled his way towards the man. Dropping to his moldable knees, he reached out. He placed a cold, slimy hand on the man's arm and willed the quirk to flow back to its owner. After a few long seconds of attempting to consciously use a quirk for the first time in 7 years, it worked. Once he'd rid his body of the sludge, the injuries he'd sustained from the attack drifted to the forefront of his mind. His throat felt raw, and every breath sent fire shooting through his lungs. Still, it was something he could manage. It was somewhat necessary for someone in his position. Maybe it was the constant ache in his joints, which had manifested a few years ago, that was to blame for the adjustment. Or maybe just Bakugo. All Might forced the villain's body-turned sludge into the plastic bottles. the man unable to escape every blow from All Might's superpowered punches. Air billowed out from the sheer force. Once his work was complete, the villain caged behind plastic, he turned back to Izuku. It is not a villain's quirk unless you are a villain, my boy. It is what you do with it that determines whether it is villainous or not. Izuku stared at him. Do you really believe that? Of course. Do you think I could become a hero? Even with my quirk? Even when nobody agrees with you? For a moment, All Might seemed to hesitate, but his smile stayed unwavering on his face. At first, Izuku tensed, but then All Might said, "It would be difficult, I cannot deny that. But I believe you can be a hero," and Izuku's shoulders dropped. And just like that he was crying. But he was smiling as well. He could be a hero. Had he ever heard those words before? Have you considered applying to UA? Izuku tilted his head. Did that question have anything to do with the rumors of All Might becoming a teacher at UA this year? Izuku nodded, sniffling. Did. It used to be my dream school. Maybe. I believe you should apply. I would say you have a good chance of being admitted into the hero course. He opened his mouth, hoping to find something to say when he did, but he didn't. For the most part, he'd stopped crying, but now he wasn't sure he wouldn't start up again. Of course, it was possible that All Might was only suggesting the option to appease him for fear of what he'd do otherwise. He had the quirk of a villain, after all. If All Might destroyed his dreams now, he'd take the option that was expected of him since the day his quirk manifested. Was All Might only encouraging him to put an end to a potential threat? To be able to supervise him? No, he shouldn't think like that. Here the symbol of peace was telling him the one thing he'd been craving to hear for nearly a decade. Izuku wasn't going to doubt him. Even if All Might was indeed looking to control him, the fact remained the same that he had said Izuku could become a hero. Why would he lie about that? Would he lie when, if it weren't possible, Izuku would eventually reach the same conclusion and become a villain in his indignation? Maybe Izuku could be a hero. All Might wouldn't know personally if it were possible. His quirk was too heroic for that. And while Izuku couldn't name a hero with a quirk truly comparable to his, and he knew just about every pro-hero in every hero-centric country, including the major underground heroes in Japan, there were some with seemingly villainous quirks. The top 10 list of heroes with villainous quirks didn't exist for nothing. Maybe Izuku really could get into a hero course. And become a hero. And prove to everyone that he wasn't villainous, that villainous quirks didn't exist. Do you really think so? Izuku asked, but it was a stupid question. He shook his head. I'll do it. I'll apply. Thank you. The sound of a blast of wind startled Izuku out of his thoughts, and he hoped All Might hadn't seen his instinctual flinch. But he couldn't have, because he was surrounded by steam. Where it had come from, Izuku had no clue. When the steam cleared, Izuku was met with the sight of a scrawny man, his face sunken like he hadn't eaten in weeks. His eyes darted around the dark underpass, searching for the All Might he'd grown up watching. He turned up empty. No, the scrawny man's bright blonde hair and black scara and blue irises were the same as All Might's. Had he been hit by a quirk? But nobody else was in the area. All Might? What happened? The man sighed, and a little rivulet of blood ran from the corner of his mouth. He swiped it away with the back of his hand without looking to see if he was even bleeding. Was it really that common an occurrence? Now you've seen the real me, kid. Don't go telling anyone about this, okay? Izuku stood in silence, gaping. What had happened to All Might's more muscular form? Had he always had two forms, or was this a new development? Was it permanent or temporary? If he was bleeding from the corner of his mouth, he was likely injured internally. And while that seemed to be something that should be temporary, he would have already sought aid from the best doctors the country, or world, could offer, so it didn't make much sense for him to be so casually bleeding unless he'd resigned himself to that life. Izuku found it best not to voice anything, figuring the hero wouldn't answer his questions anyway. So he waited for All Might to explain himself in a way he deemed appropriate for a civilian to hear. 5 years ago, All Might started, pulling the hem of his shirt up to reveal an old, gruesome gash in his side. A villain did this to me. I went through countless surgeries, and I've wasted away because of them. I can only do my hero work for about 3 hours a day now. Izuku cringed at the sight of the wound. 5 years ago? Was that when? Izuku began, but he didn't finish his thought, as any villain that came to mind surely couldn't have done so much damage. Not to the number one. This fight was never made public. So I'll ask that you keep it a secret. Of course, Izuku said. But why tell me so much? All Might sighed. Anyone who saw this, he said, gesturing from his face to his feet, would have questions. And they'd be more likely to voice them online if I didn't offer an explanation. They would be too curious to find an answer. There is still a chance you'll reveal my secret, but I trust you won't. He gave Izuku a pointed look. Izuku nodded. I'll keep it a secret. Thank you, All Might said, patting his pockets where he'd stuck both bottles to ensure the villain was still inside of them. He started toward the end of the tunnel on the side that Izuku had come from originally. Now, if you'll excuse me, I should be getting this villain to the police station. As All Might turned to leave, Izuku squeezed his eyes shut for a quick moment before opening them again, a smaller than before but stupid smile on his face. Thank you. For everything. I'll try for you, eh? I'll try my best to be a hero. The pro turned his head to meet Izuku's eyes. I wish you the best of luck, young man. As All Might shifted back into the form Izuku and the rest of the world recognized, jumped up with his quirk aiding him, and disappeared onto the top of a nearby building, Izuku watched him go. Maybe, just maybe, Izuku could be a hero. The first thing Izuku did after All Might disappeared was text his mother, who'd left 3 missed calls and 5 texts on his home screen. After assuring her he was all right, he threw his backpack over his right shoulder and started back home. He walked without care for the wounds he'd gained. His tongue still stung when it brushed against the back of his teeth, and his throat still felt like it had been scraped raw, and his shoulders still throbbed. But every ache and pain had been pushed to the back of his mind. He doubted he'd even need to scavenge his ex-Sisitio knife from beneath the pile of notebooks in his bottom left drawer when he got home. Instead, he couldn't help but replay All Might's parting words in his head, I'll wish you the best of luck. All Might wanted him to become a hero. All Might wanted him to succeed, so maybe his intentions didn't matter. Well, they did, of course, but maybe Izuku could see only what he wanted to see for the sake of motivation. The sake of necessity. Sure, his quirk was villainous or maybe not, if he chose to believe All Might's idea that some quirks weren't innately villainous. But even if All Might believed that, nobody else did. Still, his quirk wasn't useless. If he managed to get into the most well-respected hero school in the country, Eraserhead's alma mater, and never stole his peers' quirks, he had a chance to prove he wasn't a villain. Didn't he? There was a chance he could become a hero. He could become the person he had dreamed of becoming ever since everyone had started to avoid him, rather than settling for a career as a quirk analyst. There wasn't much of a precedent, considering his quirk was one of a kind. A pro hero, above ground or underground, had never been documented with a quirk that allowed its user to steal other quirks. But there was one hero who few knew existed but Izuku loved dearly, and that was one underground hero by the name of Eraserhead. While Izuku stole quirks, he erased them. Though it wasn't the same, it was by far the closest quirk to Izuku's that he had ever found. The commonality they shared was there. Both took away quirks that did not and would never belong to them. Izuku's was far worse, of course, but still. It was why Izuku had a poster of Eraserhead on the wall above his desk in his bedroom. Though he wished he could have a figurine to match, Eraserhead was too unknown. Such was the reality of an underground hero. But Izuku could understand the want to remain out of the spotlight, where above-ground pro heroes were constantly assailed by fans asking for autographs, the press asking for interviews, and the public judging their every move. He had a chance. It was what he would believe when he applied to UA and walked through its enormous front doors to take the entrance exam. Because what had he been thinking, deciding it would be best to give up and rewrite the list at least in his head, as he could only submit his form once of his top-choice high schools. If All Might had wished him luck, wanted him to succeed, who would he be to go against his wishes? Izuku would do his best to become a hero, and he wouldn't stop until he succeeded. So, with a newfound energy in his step, Izuku headed home. He wove his way through the suburb, following one sidewalk to the next and dodging anyone who was walking in the opposite direction. It was a warm day without a cloud in the sky to block the sun, so whenever Izuku looked up, he had to shield his eyes with his hand. He didn't mind at all. When he opened the front door to their apartment, his mother shot up from where she'd been lying on the sofa in the living area. "Izuku, what happened? Why were you out so late?" she asked, greeting him by shuffling over in her slippers. She stopped just before she was in reaching distance of him as he shut the door and locked it. He gave her an apologetic grin. Well, I met All Might. He told me I could be a hero." For a moment, she stared at him like she couldn't quite understand what he'd said. Considering he'd just mentioned he'd met the most popular pro-hero in the world, it was a reasonable reaction. Finally, her eyes widened, then softened. "Oh, that's wonderful, sweetie." Her voice was certainly happy, and Izuku couldn't ignore that. Still, he also couldn't ignore the tinge of fear that blighted each word. It was something he'd deciphered years ago, when he had picked up on his mother's never-ending concern. What did Izuku's peers think of him? Though he supposed it was unfair to blame it solely on that, when she also worried that he would get himself killed. "But how did you run into each other?" I might have seen a villain, and thought a pro would show up soon," he lied. No reason to make her worry more than necessary. She frowned at him. "I thought you'd finally stop that." She circled around him, checking for injuries, but he'd checked to ensure his clothes had been left intact after the sludge disappeared. "I'm sorry," he said. "The villain was just right there. I wasn't checking for fights in the area, I promise." He really was right there. "But it won't happen again. Promise." She gave him a skeptical look, to which he matched with an awkward smile. After promising to help with dinner in a couple hours, he fled to his bedroom. He dug through his backpack until he pulled out his homework, settled down in the office chair at his desk, and repositioned his All Might figurine to sit next to his Gang Orca figurine rather than behind it. He flipped open his notebook to the first blank page and plucked a pencil from the wire cup to his right. His homework went by quickly, his speed a result of the safety of his bedroom. Assignments complete, he pulled open the top right drawer of his desk and retrieved Hero Analysis for the Future No. The cover was permanently bent upwards despite the trouble he'd gone through to store it upside down and under stacks of his other notebooks. The covers of the others were in the same condition. Stalling, he thumbed through this journal's pages dedicated to All Might. It mostly consisted of breakdowns of All Might's battles that didn't end after a single punch. He brought the tip of the pencil down onto the top corner of the page and wrote, "Believes I can be a hero." He didn't need the reminder, but he couldn't help but write it. With that, he took a deep breath and flipped back to the first page of the journal. On it was a rough sketch of Izuku himself, the bold words Quirk transfer at the top, the name his mother and he had given his quirks so many years ago. A bullet point under the title read, "User can steal quirks." After he'd written the word steal quirks years ago, he had slammed the book shut and refused to pick it up for 3 days. And when he'd finally returned to the journal, it was only to start an analysis of the viscosity hero, Fuayu. To the right of the words Quirk transfer, in the same place he'd written on All Might's analysis page, Izuku wrote, "Can be a hero's quirk?" When he pulled his eyes away from the words, he drew another bullet under the first and wrote, "Needs direct skin contact from both parties." Both parties sounded far better than user and victim. Izuku had never written a page in a hero analysis journal with so little information. And, as much as he didn't mind keeping it that way, it wouldn't do. Which was why he would need to collect data on it, even if only the basics. If he couldn't do that much, what would he be able to do as a hero? Standing up, he made his way to the door, hesitating for a second. Then he turned the handle and found his way to the living area. His mother was on the sofa, now watching the movie she tended to watch when she was stressed. She'd been watching it before he'd arrived home, which made sense, since he'd been so late, but her watching it now. He didn't want to think about it. Izuku turned away from the TV. Placing his hands on the top of the cushions as he stood behind the sofa, only doing so after ensuring she was aware of his presence, she paused her movie. She looked up at him with an expectant smile, but it dropped when she met his eyes. "What's wrong?" Izuku swallowed. "I was hoping I could train my quirk. I think I want to, try for UA again." His eyes never once landed on his mother's face. So, I was thinking I would need to know at least a little more about it. Would you like to use my quirk? She asked, her voice soft. She always said that never take or steal. Would that be okay? She smiled with her eyes closed, an action few around him ever did. In fact, the only other person who consistently turned their back on him was Bakugo, as Bakugo was ever confident in his deduction that Izuku would never take his quirk. Maybe that was a kindness in its own right. Of course. She paused, then patted the cushion beside her. What would you like to try? I'm pretty sure it requires direct skin contact, but I'm not entirely sure. When she held her arm up, the sleeve of her sweater pushed up to her upper arm, he laid a hand on her wrist. His skin crawled slightly at the contact. There was no feeling to indicate anything had occurred, but as far as Izuku remembered, there hadn't been when he'd used his quirk twice before. Can you use it? His mother looked from him to the coaster on the table, where a glass of water rested on it. She leaned forward, took the glass off, and tried to pull the coaster to her hand. Nothing happened. I'll try. He turned to the coffee table and, with his palm down and fingers as relaxed as they could be, he pointed his hand towards the TV remote and motioned for it to come to him. At first, it didn't move. But he kept trying, and eventually, it started to drift into the air. When it had finally made its way to the air above his hand, he let his concentration drop. The remote fell, and he nearly dropped it when it hit his palm. He fumbled it for a second before catching it, then put it back on the table. Okay, so, now I'll give it back. Then I can try to see if it works when I touch your sleeve instead. She nodded. Whatever you'd like. I trust you. Izuku looked up from where he'd been staring at his hand, then snapped them away, tears forming in the corners of his eyes. Blinking them away, he nodded his head a few more times than necessary. He put a hand down on her wrist and willed her quirk to return to her. From there, they passed and didn't pass object attraction back and forth, experimenting with what would and wouldn't work. When Izuku had satisfied his most pressing questions, he had learned it indeed required skin contact. It also wasn't a 5-point quirk, he needed the entirety of his palm as well as his fingertips. His quirk would also work if he only touched someone's hair, he learned. It made sense, really, as skin and hair contain the person's DNA all the same, and a person's quirk was coded into their DNA as a collection of genes. Therefore, it should work with mutant-type or transformation-type quirks that altered the shape of a person's skin. As he returned object attraction for the final time, Izuku said, I was thinking I would apply to UA and a few other hero schools. Well, schools with both hero and general programs, since I don't think I can take the hero course entrance exams. But I'll apply to some schools that specialize in hero aid-related jobs too. She didn't ask him to explain. She seemed to understand why he couldn't or wouldn't take any hero entrance exam. His reasoning was simple, really. Hero entrance exams required quirks. Therefore, to compete, he would need to use his. And how could he ruin his fellow contestants' chances of a future at UA? I know you don't really want to be just an analyst, his mother said, smiling, so make sure to apply to a bunch of hero schools, okay? Tearing up once more, Izuku nodded. With each day, the date grew closer to UA's entrance exam, the first of the 6 he would be taking. He focused solely on written exams, studying everything he knew would be on them, plus anything else he thought had even a slight chance of appearing. But studying wouldn't improve his quirk, and he couldn't train his quirk more than he already had. However, he could train his body. He had stopped training physically a while ago, though he had never pushed himself enough to keep a noticeable change. Eventually, when he'd begun to question his top-choice high schools, his journals had replaced his workouts as his most prominent method of training. They didn't have to be training, after all. But while analysis was useful in its own way, it was certainly not the sole skill necessary for Japan's top hero school. Therefore, for the 10 months leading up to the exam, he ran every morning and night in the park beside his junior high school. With the Christmas money he'd saved for hero merchandise, he bought 2 adjustable dumbbells. With just those and a workout routine he'd created after reading far too many exercise websites, he trained as much as he could without injuring himself too harshly. In class, he sat above his chair until he trembled so violently he couldn't hold his weight anymore. At home, he lifted weights until his arms went numb, then did some squats until he couldn't continue. By the time the entrance exams were upon him, his daily runs had doubled in length and nearly halved in time. His dumbbells felt oddly light even at their heaviest. When Izuku cleared the hill on the brick path that led to UA's main building, he seeked in a breath. Students his age bustled about, their appearances ranging from a boy whose head was that of a lion's to a girl with bubblegum pink hair so long that she kept tripping over it. While they were interesting to observe from a distance, Izuku would have to get close to them. Trying to mentally prepare himself beforehand did little to alleviate the itch under his skin. Most of the crowd was gathered around two boards, which Izuku had to assume held the room numbers for their written exams. The rest were either walking alongside him or heading into the building, though a few were talking with the others. Those who were talking wore the same Gakurin. They must have decided to brave the behemoth that was the country's top hero school together. The thought made him glance around once more, checking for his own junior high uniform. To his relief, he saw no sign of it. As he dodged the few students who tried to brush past him, Izuku made his way over to the board on the right. There was a slightly smaller crowd around that one. His grip tightened around the straps of his backpack, which he'd brought more for show than out of necessity. While he needed a few pencils, he didn't need anything else. Still, having the backpack gave him something to grip onto to relieve some of the tension in his muscles. It also had his Xacto knife tucked away at the bottom of one of its smaller pockets, ready to be used in a bathroom stall if needed. As he approached the group, he hesitated, searching for any spot where he'd be able to see the board without getting too close to anyone. But Bakugo was nowhere in sight. Neither was anyone else with a uniform that matched Izuku's own, and nobody there knew what his quirk was. There was no reason to avoid them, really. Even so, when he stepped closer, he faltered and tripped over his own feet. Just before his face connected with the ground, his body halted. Within a second, his feet were losing contact with the brick. He scrambled in an attempt to right himself, but it did little good, and he only succeeded in turning himself over more as he floated above the ground. To his left was a girl smiling sheepishly at him. She was cute, with light brown hair that framed her round face and a pink elliptic patch on each cheek like she was permanently blushing. Each of her fingertips was colored the same pink, distinct from the color of her skin, often a sign of a 5-point quirk. A quirk that allowed her to alter the effect of gravity on anything she touched? "I stopped you with my quirk," she said, her voice naturally light. "I'm sorry I didn't ask first, but I figured you wouldn't mind me catching you." While he did appreciate the save, he wasn't thrilled by the way she put both hands on his arm to guide him back to a standing position before releasing her quirk. But he refrained from jerking his arm away and instead forced himself to stutter out an awkward, "Thank you." "You're welcome." She smiled with her eyes closed, and Izuku briefly wondered if she would do the same if she knew what his quirk was. "This is all so nerve-wracking, isn't it?" Izuku blinked. "Yeah, it is." "Well, I'm glad I could help. Good luck in there," she said, waving as she turned to head towards the board on the left. "You too," he called, but his voice was so soft he doubted she'd heard him. He felt somewhat guilty about that, but she'd walked away as soon as she'd finished speaking. She hadn't been expecting a reply. Shaking his head, he made his way over to the right board. The crowd had dispersed a little. It was enough to let Izuku see the room numbers and last names without having to bump into anyone, at least. The rooms were divided by both last name and which exam was being administered, so he'd be taking his exam in a room full of people applying for general studies, but the room next door would be full of potential hero course students. Memorizing his room number by repeating it in his head, he moved away from the crowd. Just stepping away from the gathering was a relief. Still, that didn't stop his heart from beating wildly as he walked through the massive front doors of the main building. Guided by a sign sitting in the middle of the walkway, he turned right. He dug his nails into his backpack straps. The hallway was just as impressive as he'd expected it to be, big enough to warrant a dotted line in the middle like the kind one would see on a multi-lane street. Its left side was split by classroom doors that seemed far too tall, and the right side was a wall of floor-to-ceiling windows. Unfortunately, the windows couldn't be opened. That only left the main entrance behind Izuku as an exit he was certain would work if needed. Though the size of the classroom doors would suggest UA was attempting to be courteous to students with mutant-type quirks, the doors were strangely narrow. That seemed to defeat the purpose. Not to mention they were tall enough to force Izuku to crane his head backwards to look at the little sign that the room number was displayed on. He was short for his age, yes, but even someone of All Might's height would still have to tilt their head. The first floor was dedicated to the first-year classrooms, judging by the bold red 1F that was pasted on the blue sign above the door and the 1E that was above the door at the end of the hallway. At the end of the hallway, he turned. He made sure he kept to the left side of the dotted line. Though he could tell the hallway turned left again at the end, Izuku wouldn't need to take another turn. Just before the turn was Class 1 as classroom, obvious by the blocky 1A that was painted on the door. It was the only door to have its label painted on it. At least the school acknowledged its favoritism, Izuku supposed. His exam room, Class 1D, was the second door on his left, one that came after what he assumed was a janitor's closet. The door was open, and from his angle, Izuku could see the hunting dog hero, Hound Dog, sitting at the desk at the front of the room. He was wearing his hero costume, complete with a muzzle that he could talk through. Though he knew he'd be too nervous to talk to Hound Dog for anything not exam-related or even exam-related, honestly it was still rather exciting to see a pro hero up close. As he walked, he glanced up at the other classroom doors down the hallway. When he did, he managed to catch a glimpse of the girl who'd saved him walking into Class 1A. If he wasn't mistaken, that was one of the rooms for the written portion of the hero course's exam. Izuku's eyes moved down to Class 1B, then down to Class 1C. Class 1C, he remembered seeing, was another room dedicated to the hero course examinees. Strangely, the door was closed, and a crowd of around a dozen students were loitering outside, clearly waiting to be let into the room. It seemed like the wrong time for a proctor to be late. "This is a general studies room, right?" a deep and raspy but clearly feminine voice asked. "Like, for taking the exam?" Izuku stopped in his tracks and turned to face the girl, unsure of whether he was the one she was talking to. Piercing brown eyes that were framed by black markings, a mutant-type wolf quirk, stared down at him. It took him a moment to recognize her as the girl who'd been waiting with the rest of the group to get into Class 1C, though she'd been leaning on the wall instead of talking with anyone. One blue-gray furry ear on the top of her head twitched as she waited for an answer. The fur seamlessly blended into her partially tied-back, waist-length hair, as it was the same color. "Oh, yeah it is," he said. "What's the point of going to UA for general studies? Isn't it a little expensive to go to the country's best hero school just to take a general course?" It took Izuku a moment to respond. "Well, just because UA is known for its hero course doesn't mean its general course. Well, all of its other courses, really, aren't worth taking, right? I think." Izuku threaded his fingers together. "And, for some people, they want to eventually transfer into the hero course, but they can't because of the hero course's practical exam. So they have to start in general studies. It's been done a lot in the past, actually. Is that what you're trying to do?" Izuku nodded carefully. "What's your quirk?" she asked, tail flicking behind her. Izuku forced down a wince. It's just not a physical quirk. Besides, keeping it a secret might help in the sports festival," he said, his voice not at all challenging like he'd hoped it would sound. Certainly not the most believable answer, but it was believable, at least to the point where she wouldn't be likely to try to pry an answer out of him. She snorted. "Trying to get the drop on everyone later? That, implies I get accepted." "You're not planning to?" "Of course," Izuku said. "But it's really not that simple, is it?" "Sure it is." Before Izuku could stutter out an inadequate response, the appearance of someone new caught his eye. With hunched shoulders and his hands shoved inside the pockets of his all-black outfit, he was strangely familiar. Eyes narrowing, Izuku tried to recall where he'd seen the man. Why couldn't he remember ever seeing such bloodshot, tired eyes before? Izuku said in a breath it was Eraserhead. Was he the proctor for Class 1 CS exam? Judging by the way he brushed past the throng of students gathered around the door, using nothing but a merciless glare to get them to part, that answer was a yes. For a second, Izuku wished he was Class 1 DS Proctor. But he took that idea back the moment it entered his brain. He doubted he'd be able to focus on his exam with his favorite hero sitting not 3 or 4 meters from him. Not in any hurry, is he? Izuku focused back on her. At least he's here now, right? She made a face. I guess. Seeing an opportunity to escape, Izuku said, well, I should probably, get going. Good luck on your exam. You too. Izuku gave her a parting smile and spared one last glance at Eraserhead, who was now sitting down behind the desk in the front of the classroom, before hurrying to his own room. If Eraserhead was a proctor for Class 1 CS exam, he was obviously a teacher at UA. The question was which course and which class he was the teacher of. Being an underground hero, Izuku wouldn't picture him as a teacher in the hero course. But some hero course students were bound to become underground heroes, so maybe he was a one-of-a-kind hero course teacher. Whatever the case, Izuku shouldn't be thinking about it now. He had an exam to take, and if he failed it, he would have to kiss his dream school goodbye. He had one chance, and this was it. He could think about Eraserhead afterwards. Walking through the door with newfound determination, Izuku looked to Hound Dog for directions. The hero asked his name, and when Izuku gave it, he directed Izuku to the seat in the back corner of the room. It was on the far side, which meant it was the farthest seat from the sole exit. Not exactly ideal. But it was in the back, at least. He could survey the entire classroom easily from there. The clock read that they still had 22 minutes before the exam began, and Izuku hadn't brought any of his study materials. He knew it would do him no good, as he could never truly concentrate when others were in the room. Unless it was his mother. So he opted to examine the classroom, taking in the large chalkboard on the opposite wall behind Hound Dog and the 4 columns of 5 seats each that everyone currently sat in. Most of his fellow students had arrived already, with only 4 seats still empty. He glanced at each student in the room, never looking for more. Then a second for fear they'd notice. Overall, the room was rather plain. But it had an atmosphere entirely distinct from his junior high school, which was a combination of entirely refreshing and absolutely uncomforting. When Hound Dog stood up to hand out their exams, telling them not to cheat or use a pen, Izuku pressed 2 fingers to his throat. His heart was beating erratically. Then the bell rang, and everyone else flipped to the first real page of the exam. Izuku belatedly followed their lead. He stared at the first question with uncomprehending eyes, even after reading it 3 times. Swallowing harshly, he tried again, only getting a basic idea of the question without any specifics. Glancing at the clock to find 3 minutes had already gone by, Izuku gritted his teeth. Carefully, discreetly, he moved his fingernails to the skin of his wrist and dug in with all the strength he could muster. He gritted his teeth. When he eventually let go, he found each fingernail had left a dark purple crescent embedded into his skin. Turning his arm over so nobody could see it, Izuku took a deep, steadying breath. Once again, he tried to read the first question. When his eyes landed on the particle at the end of the question, he let himself smile slightly. Not only did he understand what it was asking, the answer also came to him immediately. He was all right. He tended not to do well on tests considering he couldn't completely concentrate on them, but his month-long studies had paid off. Although he ran out of time like always, leaving the last few questions as rushed guesses, he'd been able to focus enough to answer most to the best of his ability. A few he hadn't known, but he still left the room with the feeling that he'd performed better than he had in a long while. Hopefully that was enough. It took Izuku 15 minutes to work up the courage to open Yue's letter. When he did muster up enough bravery, he ripped the envelope open with shaking hands, tearing it into multiple pieces because he'd never been gifted at opening envelopes. He nearly had a heart attack when a little device fell to the floor and bounced under his chair. He inspected it with a frown until he realized just what it was: a holographic screen projector. Seemed like a waste of money, but Yue appeared to have questionable priorities. He set the device on the table and turned it on. It flickered to life, and Izuku was met with All Might's beaming face. With the same smile he always wore, he introduced himself as Yue's newest teacher. So the rumors had been true. "It is good to see you again, young man," All Might said. "Out of 100 points, you scored an 89 on the General Studies written exam. Not the highest score, but certainly not the lowest. Izuku stared at the screen, heart fluttering before he could force himself not to hope until he'd heard the verdict. Due to this, you'll be joining 19 other students in Class 1C. Congratulations, young Midoriya. He had been accepted. Izuku couldn't help but cry, but he was grinning all the while. And when his mother inched the door open and eventually peeked inside, waiting to hear the news, he flashed her the brightest smile he'd given anyone in a while. She blinked, and then her eyes softened, and just like that, they were crying together. When Izuku crested the hill beyond UA's entrance gate once again, he had the urge to turn right back around and never return. But this was his chance, and this was what he wanted. So he dug his fingernails into his embarrassingly sweaty palms and started walking again. Eventually, he put his left hand on his backpack strap and shoved his right in his pocket just to keep it from swinging awkwardly by his side. After nearly tripping on the walkway again, he walked through the front doors of the building, which had been left open. Would the doors be open every morning? There was no way a single student would be able to open them. Even a crowd of students working together would most likely fail. At least, a crowd of students without any strength-enhancing quirks. Izuku had his schedule in his pocket in case he needed it, but he'd already memorized it in preparation, as he'd prefer not to take his eyes off of his surroundings to glance at the paper. Turning right and then left, he walked by a few students loitering in the halls. Still, there were far less than he'd expected there to be when he'd envisioned the school before walking into it a month before. Although he'd only seen the one hallway. And he had no idea where the cafeteria was, so he hoped he'd be able to follow a crowd when the lunch bell rang. Because, sadly, he would have to eat lunch to ensure his health. The classroom door was open, much to his relief. He really didn't want to make a fool of himself by attempting to open it when there were other students in the hallway. If he couldn't heave the door open, it was doubtful that his peers could either, but he still would rather not risk it. Behind the desk in the front of the room, which was identical in layout to Class 1D's classroom, was ectoplasm. He ranked number 7 on the top 10 most villainous-looking heroes list. He earned the title for the same reason the other 9 did. His quirk gave him a threatening appearance. Without any lips, his teeth were fully visible. And with the way his gums pulled from his cheeks to meet his teeth, they looked like they'd sunken into his face. That coupled with his lanky figure and stern, sharp eyes made for one of the less approachable pro-heroes in the country. As Izuku walked into the room, the pro-hero greeted him by name, and Izuku stuttered out a greeting in return. Would he even be able to concentrate on the material in his classes, as much as he normally could, when a pro was teaching them? It seemed Izuku had frozen just beyond the doorway, because a second later someone was approaching him from behind. Hopping out of the way, Izuku apologized profusely. The boy's hair sparkled like snow in the morning sunlight, and it was the same color as well. Unlike Izuku, whose dark freckles ran across the bridge of his nose to the outer corners of his eyes, he had white flecks that clustered only under the inner corners. An ice or snow-related quirk. Izuku moved to the back of the room, swinging around the desk so he wouldn't be too close to anyone as he passed by. Since ectoplasm hadn't told him to sit anywhere specific, he assumed their seats weren't assigned. The seats closest to the exit had already been taken. Only one remained in the last row, so Izuku hurried to claim it. It was rather far from the door, with 2 lines of desks on his right and one on his left when he sat down. But nobody knew what his quirk was, at least not yet. Hopefully not until the sports festival. At his desk, he glanced around the room. Would any of his classmates like him? If they asked what his quirk was, the question was nearly as common as asking for someone's name. Would he tell them or avoid the question? He tugged at his tie, which he'd haphazardly tied that morning. He couldn't help but bounce his leg under his desk, grateful he'd been able to choose a seat in the back to keep the classmates he irritated to a minimum. Hopefully they wouldn't notice, even if they were sitting beside him. It wouldn't be right of him to attempt to make friends, considering they would eventually learn what his quirk was. He would have tricked them into liking him. That is, if he didn't deter them with his personality alone before that. A minute later, another student waltzed in, his hands in his pockets and his eyes drooping like he hadn't slept properly in days. And he probably hadn't, considering the bruises under his eyes were so prominent. Izuku had them too, but they quite literally paled in comparison. His purple hair seemed to defy gravity completely, sticking up at every angle in a soft wave, contrasted by a squared face. He scanned the room, stopping when his eyes hit the one seat near the side of the room. As soon as he sat down, he put his head on his desk and closed his eyes. Out of all the classmates Izuku could see, he seemed to be the least approachable. The last 3 students wandered in not soon after. "All right, now that everyone is here, I'll introduce myself. I'm the duplication hero, Ectoplasm. I'll be your homeroom teacher this year, so I hope we can get along. I won't bore you with a speech that you don't want to listen to. So I'll just tell you this. Today we'll mostly be meeting your teachers and getting accustomed to everything. But, first, we have an entrance ceremony to go to." Izuku's new classmates shared a look with one another as Ectoplasm made his way to the door and waved for them to follow. As they left, Izuku hung back, knowing he couldn't make it out of the door first and therefore settled for last. Purple Boy raised up as their classmates walked through the doorway, one eye open to watch them. Only when everyone had passed, including a reluctant Izuku, did he move towards the door. The group followed Ectoplasm down the halls, twisting around the odd shape of the building until they were on its opposite side. A few of his classmates talked to each other as they walked. Izuku took note of every turn they made and every sign above a door that he could use as a landmarker. If he didn't want to get lost in the future, if he didn't want to give everyone another reason to mock him, he needed to learn where everything was and remember it by the end of the day. Once they reached the auditorium, Izuku wanted to cower at the sheer size of the building. It was detached from the main building, complete with 4 exits at the back and 2 down beside the wooden stage. But those 2 were emergency exits. His class filed into a line, and Izuku tried to fall back so that Purple Boy would have to take the spot in front of him, but he shot Izuku a glare. With that, Izuku somewhat scrambled to the next open seat in the row, unfortunately sandwiched between 2 classmates with only a thin armrest separating them. Izuku planted his hands in his lap with rigid arms and refused to move them. He searched for any faces he recognized, hoping to see Nice Girl and Wolf Girl in one of 2 hero course homerooms. But he couldn't spot them or Bakugo anywhere. Izuku knew for a fact that Bakugo had been offered a spot in Class 1A. His mother had called Izuku's to give her the good news, and Izuku's mother had relayed it to him. But, from the looks of it, Class 1C was the last class to arrive. The voice hero, Present Mike, took the stage a minute later with the announcement that everyone was there, so the hero courses weren't coming. Then, did they have a separate orientation? Or were they skipping it because it was only useful for the other courses? At least, at the beginning, the entrance ceremony was similar to any other schools. It lasted about an hour, and most of that time was spent by their principal, a bipedal mouse that couldn't be taller than Izuku's waist. He introduced himself as Principal Nizu, then wished his audience the best of luck during the year in the most roundabout way possible. But when he finished his final anecdote, the teachers were introduced. Not exactly common for an entrance ceremony. But each teacher was a pro-hero, so perhaps it would feel wrong not to introduce them. With every new introduction, Izuku itched to record the differences and similarities between the pros' attitudes towards the press versus a group of students. But he hadn't brought his hero analysis journal with him. And probably never would. They didn't introduce any hero course teachers, so Eraserhead either taught first-year hero course students exclusively or any class for the 2nd or 3rd years. After Principal Nizu admitted they had no time to waste with ceremonies, but he was the one who'd taken forever to give his speech, he released the classes 2 at a time. When their turn came, Izuku paid close attention to the path they took back to their classroom. Back in their homeroom, he could say with confidence that he'd be able to navigate to the auditorium on his own. The rest of their morning classes passed more quickly than Izuku had anticipated. In every class, their teachers introduced themselves and explained what they'd be covering throughout the year. When the bell rang to signal the start of lunch, Ectoplasm gave the class directions to the cafeteria. He suggested that they use the time to get to know one another. With his heart beating a little too quickly in his chest, Izuku followed the crowd. Would he have to find somebody to sit with? Or would there be an empty table for him to sit alone? Did he want to sit alone and draw such negative attention to himself? As tempted as he was to skip lunch entirely, he needed to eat. Depriving himself of food when he would be training after school ended wouldn't be his smartest idea. And his mother was too observant for him to get away with making his own lunches. So, unfortunately, he had to break his habit of skipping lunch and disappearing until the bell rang. The size of the cafeteria was nothing like he'd ever seen. It was even larger than the auditorium they'd been in earlier. From the amount of students crowding into the lunch line and around the infinite tables situated in neat rows in the middle of the massive room, Izuku suspected all the courses and years ate together at the same time. Still, he couldn't imagine that there would be extra places to sit. He had already lost his classmates in the crowd. He'd been too busy attempting to avoid running into anyone in the hallways. So he took his spot in the line without recognizing anyone beside him. He kept to himself, stepping slightly to the side so he wouldn't be pressed against anyone. After waiting a while, though not as long as he'd predicted, Izuku walked away with a steaming bowl of katsudon. If he was going to sit with a group of his peers at a lunch table for the first time in 7 years, he figured eating his favorite food should help a little. He searched for Nice Girl or Wolf Girl, but yet again, they were nowhere to be found. Hopefully they'd made it into the hero course and just were lost in the crowd somewhere where Izuku couldn't see. They both seemed like they'd make great heroes one day, and they both seemed like they deserved the chance to follow that dream. Looking for anyone else he recognized, Izuku's eyes eventually landed on a head of hair that was hard to miss. Purple Boy was sitting surrounded by students who looked like second or third years, but the seat across from him was open. Briefly, Izuku considered heading somewhere else. But every table nearby had already been filled. And the longer he stood out in the open surrounded by such a large crowd, the more his skin prickled just below the surface. So he inhaled deeply to steady himself and took a spot at the empty seat. Purple Boy looked up at the sound of Izuku's tray hitting the table. Staring at him blankly, he seemed to silently demand that Izuku justify himself. I'm sorry if I'm, bothering you, but there weren't any other seats, and he trailed off, his voice getting softer as his sentence got longer. "Am not here to make friends." Izuku blinked at him, stunned into silence for a moment. Then, "Why are you here?" The boy stared at him, eyes narrowed. He clearly wasn't looking to make friends. Which might work in Izuku's favor, actually. If they could strike up an agreement, silent or verbal, they could sit next to but largely ignore each other every day. Unless Izuku had just ruined it. Gruffly, he said, "To be a hero." Izuku's heart skipped a beat. "Me too." The boy raised his head from where he'd been staring at his rice, clearly more interested in their conversation now despite his face remaining neutral. He stared at Izuku as if he were prompting him to continue, so Izuku did. I actually didn't take the hero course's exam, since, well, I knew my quirk, it wouldn't work with the practical portion." "Did you take the hero course exam and the general studies exam, or just the general studies?" "Both." "So you didn't score enough points? Or did you not score any?" he asked, then cringed. I'm not. Not to say you're not strong or that your quirk isn't strong, because I'm sure that both are. I was just asking since you would only take both exams if you were concerned that your quirk wouldn't work well with the practical exam. So maybe your quirk is physical but takes too much time to recharge? And therefore you knew you wouldn't be able to score enough points? Or it has some sort of limit that you knew might not work at all, which would leave you with 0 points. Izuku paused, then ducked his head slightly enough to show he was apologetic but not enough to lose sight of the boy whose name he still didn't know. If he was lucky, his head was bowed enough to keep his faint blush hidden. "I'm sorry. For all of that." Purple Boy hummed in response. But Izuku could tell by the look on his face that he wasn't irritated, so he tried to brush his embarrassment away. "It didn't work much. Points didn't go to me." "Why not?" Izuku asked, frowning. If he'd defeated the robots that were apparently the enemies in the exam that year, what kind of quirk could possibly keep him from being awarded the points? Quirk's brainwashing. Points went to brainwashed kids. He'd been eating comfortably between his clipped sentences, but he'd stopped as soon as the word brainwashing left his mouth. Before Izuku could draw a conclusion from that, Purple Boy continued with a half-smirk, half-snarl, "Villainous, right?" That wasn't a question that he didn't know the answer to know, that was a question whose answer he was waiting for Izuku to confirm. There was someone like Izuku at UA? Is that what people call your quirk? He didn't respond, but he didn't need to. How does it work? Izuku asked. If you, don't mind me asking. Purple Boy narrowed his eyes. Control anyone who responds TA question oh mine. Only simple commands. Only activates when I want. Izuku fiddled with his chopsticks to give his hands something to do. Well, it might not mean anything to you to hear me say this, but I think your quirk is perfect for a hero. Though his face didn't seem capable of intense emotion, Izuku could see Purple Boy waiting for his next words like he was expecting Izuku to be either lying or about to take them back. Izuku continued. You could just command villains to surrender, couldn't you? And, sure, your quirk has a condition that could pose some problems once villains figure out what it is, but I'm sure there are ways around it. Like, for example, what if you became an underground hero? That way, your name and quirk would stay relatively unknown. Even if rumors spread about you, underground heroes tend to be unrecognizable. But, I guess if you try to make a name for yourself during the sports festival, people might remember what your quirk is later down the line. But probably not, since most people don't recognize Eraserhead, not even the police, and he went to Udata. People will forget your name, and you could disappear into the shadows, I think. Before Izuku could apologize again, Purple Boy asked, Really? Izuku didn't want to give too much away, to reveal that he too had a villainous quirk, one far more villainous than brainwashing. The brainwashing was even villainous at all. But Purple Boy would eventually ask about his quirk anyway. And if his peers had called his quirk villainous, then he would understand, wouldn't he? And from what it sounded like, he had never been told his quirk could be heroic before. Izuku could change that. Izuku smiled softly. Of course, people doubt you because of your quirk, right? He asked, doing his best to maintain a steady expression. Purple Boy nodded slowly. But it's what you do with brainwashing that determines whether it's villainous or not. Such was true for Purple Boy's quirk. It was deemed villainous for what its user could do with it if they so chose to. It wasn't villainous for merely existing. When used by a hero, his quirk would be nothing short of heroic. Sure, to incapacitate villains he would need to temporarily take their free will. But was that not what every hero did in one way or another? Although, was it not somewhat cruel of Purple Boy to brainwash other examinees into scoring points for him? In the end, the points had gone to them instead, but he sure hadn't been hoping for that. But he had just been trying to take the first step towards his dream. Who was Izuku to say what he had done was cruel? It wasn't as if Purple Boy was the only one who would have tried to sabotage his competitors, and he only did so because his quirk forced him to. So, while Purple Boy's quirk seemed villainous, it could only be considered as such under certain circumstances that wouldn't apply to him. After all, everyone had technically been sabotaging the other examinees by destroying robots that another could have fought. Therefore, there was a clear distinction to be made between Purple Boy and Izuku's quirks. Whenever Izuku used his, no matter what situation it may be, it hurt someone. That was what separated their quirks. Purple Boy stared at him a little while longer, then asked, Your quirk? Izuku pursed his lips together, wringing his fingers together. It's not much really. It's kind of useless. For a hero? Izuku wrinkled his nose, then laughed a little. Yeah, that wasn't the best answer, was it? It'd be hard to be a hero without a useful quirk, he trailed off. Then he took a deep breath and said, Call it quirk transfer. I can take the quirk of anyone I touch and use it for myself. Purple Boy met his gaze when Izuku glanced up briefly to gauge his reaction. Oddly enough, there was no sign of disgust. No fear or horror or panic on his face. Only a partial understanding. Powerful. Izuku smiled down at the table, but he didn't feel it. It's villainous, right? The boy huffed. I didn't think mine was. He paused, frowning as he thought, and Izuku waited for him to continue. No hero exam? Well, I didn't want to use my quirk. If I had, well, it wouldn't have been fair of me to take away the other examinees' chances of getting in. Purple Boy gave him a look for that slight irritation present in the curve of his lips. What had Izuku said? Did he think Izuku was implying his choice of brainwashing some of the other examinees wasn't fair to them? Izuku couldn't say it was fair, but he understood that Purple Boy didn't have much of a choice in the matter. So he moved to tell him that, but he didn't get the chance. You want to be a hero? Of course, Izuku insisted, not sure as to why that was being brought into question. Had bypassing the hero exam entirely given off the impression he wasn't dedicated enough? Shouldn't it prove he was more dedicated, since he refused to use his villainous quirk to harm others? Why? Because I want to prove I'm not a villain.
What?
I want to be the person people can rely on, the person they can trust to protect them, even with my quirk. I want people to believe that I'm good, Izuku said. Purple Boy just hummed one low, long tone. Izuku leaned forward slightly. Why do you want to be a hero? Can't help what your heart longs for. A soft smile broke out on Izuku's face. That's a great reason. Hitoshi Shinso, he said. He didn't bow his head in greeting, but Izuku didn't mind, because it meant he didn't have to either. Not that he expected Shinso to hurt him, he didn't have a direct reason to. Especially not with the audience of a crowded cafeteria. Izuku Midoriya. The bell rang not long after, and they walked back to their homeroom in a comfortable silence. Well, calling it comfortable might have been slightly generous. However, Shinso clearly wasn't much of a talker, so Izuku let the silence linger. They both were able to make it back to the classroom of their own volitions, with neither following the other. Much to Izuku's relief. It was their first class after lunch that Izuku had been looking forward to, simply because it was Quirk studies. Physical education came next. They spent the PRD taking physical fitness tests, from a sitting toe touch to grip strength. Izuku was happy to see that in every test, his results had gone up considerably since junior high. Well, except for the sitting toe touch. He'd need to incorporate more stretching into his daily training. The day ended after their 7th PRD, and when there were 5 minutes left, Izuku started to pack away his notes out of habit. When he glanced toward Shinso, he saw him doing the same. Did he too pack his belongings away early to escape the classroom before someone could catch up to him? Shinso had experienced at least some of the same treatment as Izuku had, so what if it wasn't simply a desire to go home quickly? But he didn't look nervous or cautious as much as he just looked bored, so maybe not. When everyone began to filter out of the door after ectoplasm dismissed them, Izuku lingered in the back. Shinso did the same, both straps of his backpack around his shoulders. Once the rest had cleared out, surprisingly enough, Shinso waited for Izuku. He didn't have the look in his eye that Bakugo always had when he waited for Izuku, so slowly, Izuku walked over to his side. Train with me. After school, Shinso said. You want to train with me? Shinso gave him a look.
Right.
Obviously, Izuku said. But where? And in what?
Why me?
Or, no, that last one is obvious.
Sorry.
But am I really a good choice? Park near here. Sparring. Oh, that's a pretty good idea, actually, since we'll both run into situations where we won't be able to use our quirks. If we become heroes, that is, or even transfer, Izuku blinked. Not to say I think you won't transfer or become a hero, of course. I just, well, it's never guaranteed. Start tomorrow. Okay, tomorrow. Thank you. For offering, Izuku said, grimacing at the sound of his own words. Luckily, Shinso had already turned around and walked a little ways ahead. After a moment of hesitation, Izuku decided to let Shinso walk home alone, where he couldn't bother him with his inability to hold a conversation. When Shinso was far enough ahead, Izuku started home as well. The sports festival was rapidly approaching, and Izuku and Shinso were preparing in the best way they knew how, by sparring. Which was why they were headed to their favorite training site. As they turned right to walk into the hallway, Izuku glanced down the hall and waved at Uraraka Nice Girl when their eyes met. They had bumped into each other on the last day of their first week at UA, as she had earned a spot in Class 1A. Izuku had gotten the name of Wolf Girl Okumin Kirano much in the same way. Though rather than congratulating him for his acceptance like Uraraka, she just teased him for it. She had, playfully, bragged about her standing as a Class 1B student. Izuku had dutifully listened until Bakugo had appeared down the hallway from her. After spotting him, Izuku had stuttered an excuse and darted down the hall to catch up with Shinso, who'd gone ahead as soon as Izuku had stopped to talk. Shinso and Izuku had taken to sparring 3 times a week on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. It was a schedule they'd been keeping for a month. But, at Izuku's suggestion, they agreed to train 5 days a week for the 2 weeks before the festival, then give themselves 2 days off just before the day of. It was now a week before the festival, and they found themselves training in the park closest to UA's campus. The park was full every day they came, though most tended to gravitate towards the lawn that sat in the center. On the kempt grass, people sat in the spring sun with towels under them, threw frisbees or footballs over others' heads, and played with their dogs. A wide sidewalk wrapped around the lawn, and dotted along the sidewalk were vendors who could convince nearly anyone to buy a popsicle or a taiyaki. Shinso and Izuku had learned to give the vendors a wide berth when they headed to their spot. But, on more than one occasion, they'd gotten themselves a snack on their way home. On the north side of the park was where they'd found their ideal spot. It was the quietest area they'd been able to find, and they'd spent an hour searching for the perfect place. It was hidden behind a cluster of towering trees that dropped pine cones on the pine straw below. It was nothing more than a small patch of grass that clearly wasn't cut as often as the main lawns, and it wasn't long or wide enough for anyone else to make use of it. Well, it wasn't as small as Izuku made it out to be, but it might as well have been, since the pine cones that covered the outer rim weren't forgiving when fallen on. Izuku had learned that the hard way. Shinso had laughed at him, but just the next week, he'd met the same fate. Now, he made a habit of viciously kicking any pine cone he saw. Whenever Izuku saw him do it, he had to hide his smile. As Shinso began their second sparring match of the day with a roundhouse kick, Izuku could see his improvement. His kicks were both higher and faster. As he ducked under Izuku's jab and countered with a punch of his own, Izuku could see the way he pulled his fist back as quickly as he'd thrown it out. It hadn't taken him long to realize Izuku would throw him over his shoulder when he let his arm linger after a punch, but the change hadn't come easy. He'd forgotten often. And Izuku never passed up an opportunity to try a new throw he'd learned from watching martial arts videos. Now, however, any attempt Izuku made to grab his arm ended in failure. While Izuku had never had a problem pulling his punches back, his most glaring limitation was dodging attacks. Just as he'd expected it to be. He was surprisingly gifted at predicting Shinso's movements. He was able to decipher in a split second whether Shinso would be throwing a punch, hook, uppercut, or a kick depending on the way the fight was going and the way he shifted his weight. However, despite knowing what attack was coming before it had been thrown, Izuku's body froze when faced with a blow about to land. And when Shinso landed a hit, it was solid and brutal. His power was a testament of his brute strength and nearly perfect form. This habit of Izuku's was one that had left him with too many bruises to count for far longer than it took Shinso to learn to pull his punches back. At first, he'd only improved his ability to counter a kick. Catching a kick came easier to him. After all, it required him to take the brunt of the attack in order to pull Shinso's foot out from under him. Closing in on Shinso before he could put true power into his kick also came easy, since Izuku was still letting himself take a hit to do so. But, over time, Izuku had started to walk home without quite as many parts of his body aching as before. He'd learned to slip just out of the way of Shinso's punches, letting Shinso's knuckles graze his cheek instead. It was the only compromise his body seemed to allow, so he worked with it, learning to move his body so slightly that he essentially stood still. Still, he occasionally took a blow full force. When the attack seemed too familiar and his body locked up, Izuku pushed forwards, grabbing the back of Shinso's neck and driving his knee into Shinso's chest. It was the best place he could think of, as it would only knock the breath out of him. Against a different opponent, Izuku's knee might drive into a nose. Without his breath, Shinso was easy to knock over with a sweep to the back of his knees and a push to the shoulder. Izuku stared down at Shinso, watching him to ensure he was all right. Shinso groaned and sat up. "Happy now?" Izuku replied, and the next thing he knew, he was on the ground, lying on his back. Shinso gave him a smug grin from above, showing his perfectly straight teeth. "That's cheating," Izuku said. "We agreed on not using our quirks." All's fair. Izuku pouted more for show than anything else, then got to his feet by himself. Shinso had stopped offering a hand ever since Izuku had stuttered out an, it's okay. You don't ever have to, during their first week of sparring. Clearly Izuku's face had, unfortunately, betrayed the true reason for his words. Shinso didn't ask why, though. Izuku would forever be grateful for that. Instead, Shinso had made a comment about how he didn't like to be touched either. While it didn't achieve its desired effect, Izuku understood his intention all the same. "Another?" Shinso asked. Izuku nodded and they put some distance between each other and raised their fists to rest just beneath their chins. Shinso made no move to resume their fight, and instead said, "Have an idea what the festival be? What the 3 events will be?" Izuku asked, just to give Shinso an opportunity to correct him, but he didn't take the chance. Instead, he launched himself forward and toward Izuku, pulling his right arm back slightly. He had a habit of telegraphing his first moves no matter how many times Izuku suggested he try to stop. Izuku slipped to the side and said, "Well, the 3rd round is always a one-on-one match of some kind. Other than that, I haven't had the chance to look at the last decade's sports festivals yet to try to predict what the first 2 rounds will be. Mr. Terumi always assigns so much homework." Shinso tried a left hook, saying, "He doesn't." Izuku ducked under it and landed a jab to Shinso's shoulder. He was breathing so heavily that it took a while to force out each sentence. Maybe Shinso was onto something, saying only a few words at a time. "Okay, maybe he doesn't, but I can't just." A nasty kick to the back of his knees payback for earlier, Izuku suspected sent him to the ground. Izuku let himself fall backwards, rolling over his shoulder and hopping back up just to meet a punch to the face. At least Shinso had the decency to hold back enough to not clobber him like usual. Either that or he was getting weaker from exhaustion. They had been sparring for a while, and neither of them had the most impressive levels of stamina. Izuku shook his head and snapped his eyes open. Shinso stayed where he was, so Izuku backed up a few steps and let out a breath. "I can't not write everything I think of," Izuku continued. Shinso rolled his eyes. "Quirk studies is too interesting. How can you only write the bare minimum? I think those villains will show up? The ones from the USJ attack?" Izuku asked, his foot connecting with Shinso's sternum and sending him stumbling backwards. Again, they backed off and took a moment to catch their breaths. "I don't think so. While it would definitely leave an impression if they could get past security, they would also have to get past security. And with the lengths UA has been going to keep the campus safe enough to hold the festival this year, I really doubt they'll try. It's just not worth it. They attacked the hero courses training for All Might, so I don't think it makes sense for them to try to start a rematch when he'll be surrounded by other pro heroes in the stands and patrolling the stadium. They'll be back." Izuku frowned and looked down at the ground, but he kept an eye on Shinso's grass-stained sneakers to ensure he didn't try anything. "Probably. I think they only know where All Might is when he's at UA. Which is pretty concerning because that means there's someone with access to UA's private information, or someone at UA is close enough to All Might to know where he is. Which could mean there's a mole. Besides, when he's at UA, nobody really knows where All Might will be. UA is probably the only place they can attack and know All Might will really be there." The idea wasn't exactly a pleasant one, especially considering what Izuku knew. He'd heard of the attack on the USJ from Uraraka, and she'd spoken of an inhuman monster with an exposed brain and multiple quirks that the villains had brought to kill All Might. How the monster had been created to hold multiple quirks, Izuku wasn't sure he wanted to know. Apparently, the fight had dragged on for a while. The monster the Nomu had been an equal match to All Might's strength. All Might had won eventually, but Izuku had a terrible feeling that the fight had lessened All Might's 3-hour time limit. The monster had been captured and had been taken into custody, so it wouldn't return. But how much damage had it done? Izuku looked back up, tilting his head and squinting when he saw the look on Shinso's face. Eyes widening, Izuku strode closer to him. "Have you been asking me questions to stall for time? How many hours of sleep did you get last night? Come on, let's take a break." He sat down in the grass, letting the blade stab through his pea uniform pants, and waited for Shinso to do the same. Shinso huffed a laugh. 2? 3? It had been during one of their previous sparring sessions when Izuku had discovered just how little sleep Shinso got. With the ever-present dark bags under his eyes, Izuku knew he couldn't be sleeping much. Still, after Shinso had nearly collapsed after a particularly grueling day of training, he admitted to having insomnia. While Shinso could fall asleep relatively easily, he couldn't stay asleep. In his words, it was the result of bad genetics. He woke up just because his mind had forced him to. Sleeping pills seldom worked on him, and avoiding electronics a couple hours before bed or changing the temperature in his room never had an effect. It was an issue Shinso had been dealing with for years, so he had shifted to copious amounts of iced coffee in the mornings. It was a rare day when Shinso walked through Class 1C's door in the morning without a cup in the largest size his favorite coffee shop offered. "You should have told me," Izuku said. "Let's call it a day and skip tomorrow, okay? One day off won't kill us." Shinso hummed. "I'm fine." "You're not," Izuku insisted. Shinso yawned, not bothering to cover his mouth with his hand. Dropping his chin into his palm, he stared at the ground, struggling to keep his eyes open. They stayed in that position on the ground, and Izuku let the silence linger. A cool breeze rustled the trees around them, and it felt wonderful as it cooled his skin. It seemed to be having the same effect on Shinso, as he looked less likely to vomit now. His chaotic locks blew in the breeze, and if his hair wasn't already a mess, Izuku would worry it would get tangled in the wind. Izuku's hair was always a curly mess as well, so much so that the breeze could do no more damage to it. Another 15 minutes passed before Shinso got to his feet, and he turned to see if Izuku was following. It was certainly a contrast to the looks Bakugo gave him that almost beckoned him to walk into a beating willingly. Sure, the expectant look Shinso gave him was a reminder of that. But Izuku knew Shinso meant no harm the way Bakugo always had, so his caution stayed at a relative minimum. He had no particular reason to attack Izuku, after all. Still, Izuku hesitated before standing up to take a place by Shinso's side. As they headed down the slight incline of the park, walking alongside the sidewalk but far enough away from the vendors, Izuku asked, "What will you do for the sports festival? Can you do anything? To get enough rest?" "Pray." Absent-mindedly, Izuku noted that asking Recovery Girl to heal the aches that had stuck with him the day before was one of his best ideas as of late. He'd fallen asleep in record time, strangely. The exhaustion that came with her quirk forced him into a deep sleep that wasn't interrupted until his alarm went off the next morning. Izuku woke up often in the night, by just about any slight noise, from his mother moving quietly to the bathroom to the hoot of an owl in the tree outside his window. Eventually, he'd turn to listening to ambient music an hour before he fell asleep. That way, he could grow used to it. Then, it could drown out the sounds that would normally startle him awake. It worked about as often as it didn't. But, the night before, he'd been so fatigued that he hadn't had time to start his playlist before he was asleep. And yet he'd slept through the night. Such a feat was worth remembering. He might just have to take advantage of Recovery Girl's quirk more often, because it was likely the only reason he'd been able to fall asleep at all. Expecting such a stressful event the next day almost guaranteed he wouldn't be sleeping on an average night. Of course, the reason he'd asked for Recovery Girl's help was because the bruises he'd accumulated over the weeks had finally become too abundant to ignore. So he and Shinso had journeyed to the nurse's office in hopes of not entering the sports festival on the verge of collapse. Hopefully, her quirk had had a similar effect on Shinso's sleep as it had had on Izuku's. As he broke out into a jog and set a decent pace for himself, confident that the speed wouldn't sap his energy, Izuku reviewed his predictions for the day in his head. Hopefully it would bring some comfort. He had spent his evenings searching up and watching every first-year sports festival dating from the previous years to 2 decades in the past. After recording what the first 2 rounds were for each year, he compared them. The third round was always a one-on-one match. From the looks of it, there was about an 80% chance it would be a simple quirk versus quirk fight. It wasn't a perfect number by any means, but it would do. Izuku figured UA wouldn't reuse events that had been seen in the past few years, so he immediately eliminated a handful of possibilities. There was always a chance they would come up with a new event, But there were only so many options with the space and equipment they had. And judging from his notes, Yue wasn't averse to rehashing old ideas. Not as long as they were old enough. However, obstacle races seemed to be Yue's go-to for the first round. It hadn't been used in the past few years, either. So, if the first event could be anything, Izuku had a strong suspicion it would be an obstacle race. It had always been done in the first round in previous years. It was best for a qualifying round, after all. Realistically, Izuku had nothing more than a vague idea of what the day would hold. But researching was always necessary, always calming when he was forced into a situation that he could not choose. He increased his speed slightly, feeling the morning breeze brush his hair out of his face. It calmed his nerves just a little. His heart was beating erratically, and running accounted solely for a portion of that. Yue's main building began to take shape in front of him, and after jogging through the entrance gate, he slowed to a hurried walk. He took the narrow brick path that wrapped around the left side of the building. Another left directed him towards the first of 3 stadiums behind the school. In front of each was a path framed by food stalls, and Izuku breathed in the distinct smell of steaming takoyaki as he watched another vendor place some skewered dango in a miniature display holder. He saw no sign of a vendor selling something that would require them to create smoke or melt sugar. Even so, he held his breath as he walked. The stalls were bright and colorful, each one decorated by a different color scheme that clashed with the colors of the stalls beside it. People of all ages and quirks were scattered around the walkway. Izuku walked around the stalls to avoid the worst of the crowd. Although the familiar itch to escape coursed through his veins, he couldn't help but smile politely back at anyone who glanced his way. Wearing his PE uniform, everyone could instantly tell he was a competitor, and it showed in the way he received far more second glances than he was comfortable with. Izuku slipped into the side entrance marked by a sandwich board with the bold words "Participants Only" pasted on the front. The only light in the hallway came from sunlight filtering in from both ends of the tunnel. Still, he could see well enough to find the room that had been designated for Class 1C with a piece of printer paper taped to the door. Before walking in, he discreetly wiped his hands on the side of his pants, hoping to dry the sweat that had been building up on his palms. Inside the room sat about a quarter of his class. Since UA required the general course to participate alongside the hero course, he'd soon see the rest of his classmates. 2 square tables that had been pushed together took up half the room, and a couple of foldable chairs had been pushed under each side of each table. Everyone seemed to be gathered towards the back corner of the room, which suited Izuku just fine. It meant he could take the seat closest to the only door. Shinso was not among the students in the room. Izuku frowned. Once settled in his chair, Izuku pulled his phone out of his pocket and unlocked it. He clicked on his Photos app. The last few dozen photos had all been taken the night before, each one a picture of a different analysis page from Hero Analysis for the Future No. He scrolled through them slowly, reading through each one until the words made in his scratchy handwriting started to make sense. He hadn't had the courage to bring the physical copy with him. What if someone noticed it, asked about it, and laughed when he told them? Or what if they saw his journal and believed he was taking notes on so many different quirks to decide which would be best to steal in the future? He would be revealing his quirk soon after all. Izuku dug his fingernails into his arm, under his sleeve until his nerves calmed. Staring at his phone, he narrowed his eyes to decipher a particularly messy bullet point. Izuku had included his peers' pages Shinso's, Uraraka's, Kirano's, and Todoroki's in the photos he'd taken. Brushing up on their quirks couldn't hurt. Not that he really thought he needed to, as he tended to memorize information naturally. Most of the analysis on his classmates' quirks wasn't confirmed, but he had a good idea of what they were and weren't capable of. The analysis he had for Shinso and Uraraka and Kirano was based on what they'd told him about their quirks. Todoroki's analysis was based on what Izuku had found online. Being the son of the number 2 hero, there were plenty of articles about him. But Izuku made sure to include much more original content, of course. The door squeaked open, and when Izuku looked up, Shinso met his gaze. He waltzed in with his hands in his pockets, posture as lazy as usual. The bags under his eyes seemed slightly lighter, thankfully. Izuku put his phone down on the table, turning it off and setting it face down. Shinso dragged the metal chair beside Izuku out and took a seat. See the stands? Izuku had specifically decided not to look at the stands, actually. He was well aware that the sight of thousands packed together to watch them would only stress him out more. Please don't remind me, he groaned. Shinso snorted. First round. Izuku put a hand on his chin. I really couldn't narrow it down all that well, and this is really a complete guess, but there's a chance it'll be an obstacle race. UA seems to like using those a lot. Shinso hummed. The rest of his class wandered through the door not long after, clearly not happy with the fact that they were being forced to participate. The intercom crackled to life not seconds after the last person walked through the door. Present Mick's voice filled the room, telling them to make their way into the stadium. Shinso rose up out of his seat without a word, and Izuku did the same. Soon, they were walking into the sunlight again, the sun blazing in the sky. Its harsh light forced Izuku to close his eyes for a moment. He blinked them open to ensure he could keep an eye on his surroundings. He brought a hand up to block the sun, keeping it there as he walked with legs that felt a little weak. Was it necessary to have a live audience? Glancing around, there were 8 exits in the stadium, each leading to what looked like a dark hallway like the one they had just come from. Izuku then looked up to the stands and instantly regretted it. They were packed to the brim, nearly overflowing into the stairs that divided each section with the sheer amount of spectators who'd come to watch the first years compete. The crowd was a roaring mass. It made sense for the stands of the first-year stadium to be packed, of course. It was the place citizens went to catch a glimpse of new talent and new quirks, and pro heroes went to scout for students to offer internships to. The thought of so many people, including pro heroes, watching him made Izuku shudder. As a general course student, he wasn't allowed an internship with a pro, but they would still be watching if he managed to make it past the first round. If he didn't make a good impression now, they might disregard him completely in the future. If he ever transferred. He kept pace with Shinso, who was glaring at their soon-to-be competition ahead of them. On the stage was Midnight, in her hero costume as usual, though now she was holding a whip. Above them at the top of the stands, Present Mike was announcing the arrival of each class from a press box. Eraserhead sat beside him. Of course Eraserhead would be watching. Now, if Izuku made a fool of himself, he could never live it down. Not that he would have anyway, but still. While Class 1A and Class 1B got more flattering introductions from Present Mike, the General Studies classes were introduced by name only. Shinso scowled at that, and Izuku couldn't blame him. At first, the animosity towards the hero courses had surprised Izuku. But they did have All Might as their teacher, and they clearly had preferential treatment over the other courses. Many despised the cancellation of UA's events that were open to the public, which was a result of the USJ scare. It was to protect the students from villains, so Izuku saw no problem with it. But he also wasn't a fan of events that included crowds of people, so he might have been a bit biased. Sure, sometimes even he could find the school's blatant favoritism irritating. But no school was perfect, and by the way Izuku came home injured solely from his training with Shinso, it was far better than his junior high had been. Even if only because nobody knew what his quirk was. As they stopped at the back of the crowd, Midnight yelled over the crowd, "Silence, everyone!" She paused for a moment to let the audience quiet down. For the student pledge, we have the student who placed first in both the hero course's practical and written exams, Katsuki Bakugo. Shinso scowled as Bakugo dragged himself up the stairs to the stage. Izuku found a place behind him, letting Shinso's body shield him from Bakugo's sight. When he and Shinso stood side by side, Izuku's full height barely reached Shinso's chin, so he hoped that would keep him hidden. Bakugo glared up at the stands, his hands in his pockets and his back hunched. Stepping up to the microphone and making no move to take it out of its stand, he said, "I just want to say, I'm gonna win this." The crowd of students erupted into complaints, their derision all directed towards Class 1. Bakugo moved back to the rest of his class in the crowd below the stage, and one of his classmates wasted no time in scolding him. He chopped at the air with strangely robotic motions. His fingers were squeezed together like they'd been glued. Without further ado, Midnight began awkwardly, "It's time for us to get started. The first game is what you'd call a qualifier. This is where you begin feeling the pain. She held her whip up, pointing it in the direction of the screen that would soon display the name of the first round's event. The options started to spin, too quickly to read what they were. Eventually, the spinning slowed and landed on obstacle race. Tada! Shinso raised his eyebrows. You're right. Izuku grinned sheepishly, running a hand through his hair. I did a lot of research. Before the crowd could begin to murmur, Midnight continued, remember, everyone, using your quirks is not only allowed but encouraged. You may even use them to sabotage your fellow competitors, as long as you don't intentionally hurt them. And make sure to use them well, because only the first 42 students to finish the race will be moving on to the second round. Good luck. Second round. Izuku shook his head. That one I really couldn't narrow down nearly as much. It could be any number of things. Maybe a game of capture the flag? That one they used 6 years ago. We'll see soon, he said, putting an effective end to the speech Izuku had been about to give. He nodded in the direction of the entrance to the obstacle race, to which the mammoth stone doors had just begun to slide open. Let's go. Oh, yeah. Izuku said, jogging to catch up. We should try to get a spot up near the front. Don't you think? Izuku tried to suppress a frown. Getting closer to the front was the best course of action, he believed, but it also meant pushing through a mass of people. But the alternative outcome was far worse. If the hallway behind the entrance is as narrow as it looks, it'll almost be an obstacle in its own right. Think. The people who get stuck in the crowd will be at a disadvantage, since it'll probably take a while to even get out of the hallway. There's a chance someone, probably a hero core student, will try to take out the frontrunners, though. So maybe we get a spot near the front but not quite there? Maybe? What do you think? Shinso nodded and headed off, so Izuku followed him as he wove his way into the crowd and forced his way as close to the front as he could. Izuku's skin prickled all the while. They didn't get awfully far, but it was better than taking a spot in the back. No hard feelings? Right? Izuku confirmed. Good luck. It wouldn't make as strong of an impression if they used each other to succeed, as that would imply they could only do well when they fought together. They needed to establish that they were worthy of the hero course on their own. Therefore, they would move separately. You too. In the mass of students, nobody was talking. Even so, just the sound of the throng shuffling their feet in anticipation made it difficult to hear the buzzer count down the seconds. But when it struck 0, it was louder than he'd expected. Certainly loud enough to hear across the stadium. Though he was expecting a noise, he could feel himself flinch. Everyone was off in a flash, shoving themselves into the writhing crowd in the hallway. Shinso and Izuku were quickly pushed away from each other. Izuku kept moving forward, passing the first round was priority. And, if possible, doing so in a way that would draw some positive attention to himself. But positive attention would be difficult if he used his quirk. The other side of the hallway seemed so far away as Izuku struggled to avoid being trampled into the ground. Barely keeping his head above the mass, Izuku watched as Todoroki, recognizable by his half-red, half-white hair, broke away from the group and made it out to the other side. Todoroki's right hand twitched. That was the sole warning anyone got before a wave of ice was sent barreling towards everyone behind. The people closest to Todoroki were instantly trapped in a thick layer of ice that crawled up their legs and stopped just above their knees. As the ice traveled farther out, it lost some of its strength, coating the ground in a fine layer but not freezing anyone in place. In front of Izuku, a girl slipped on the ice and flailed for purchase. She clung to the boy next to her and pulled him down with her as she fell. Izuku nearly went with them, but he steadied himself and stepped over them as carefully as he could. Hoping they wouldn't get hurt but unable to waste time, he kept pushing himself forwards. Finally, he made it through, sliding a little too far and stumbling. As he caught himself, he looked ahead. He didn't have much more ground to cover before the ice gave way to the packed dirt of the path. Right behind Izuku was Shinso, who had brainwashed 3 students into carrying him. Though it seemed a little cruel to brainwash them into such a thing, he knew Shinso was out to win, and therefore being the ones he brainwashed might actually be an advantage. Behind Shinso was a mass of students so packed together that they could barely move at all. They had made the right call. 42 students would live to see the second round. In other words, Izuku needed to hurry. Without a quirk to aid him in any way, he was at a severe disadvantage from the very beginning. But the only quirk he could have possibly taken before the festival began was his mother's. There was a slim chance it could have been helpful, but it wasn't enough to warrant him taking it from her. While he could take a quirk from one of his fellow competitors, the same reasoning he'd used to justify avoiding the hero exam could be applied. Sure, the sports festival was his best chance of making a name for himself, of getting the hero course teachers to notice him. And sure, maybe when compared to the entrance exam, the sports festival was less important. But there had to be plenty of competitors around him, even the hero course students who didn't have quirks that would aid much in an obstacle race. And if he used his quirk so early on and people started talking about it, which they were sure to do with an awful quirk like his, he would be at a disadvantage in the rounds that mattered more. After all, everyone would know to avoid him. He would have to use his quirk eventually, but he didn't need it yet. He could qualify without using his quirk. On solid ground now, he started to pass the people running around him, until the ground began to tremble. Glancing up, he was met with the sight of the hulking robots the hero course often used to train the students. They were nearly as tall as the middle rows in the stands were high, creaking and groaning loud enough to leave ringing in Izuku's ears whenever they shifted. Their faces were flat and full of red camera lenses that resembled spider eyes, glinting in the sunlight. Everyone came to a stop a safe distance away, the crowd much thinner than it had been at the entrance gate. Todoroki kept pressing forward, throwing another wave of ice at the monsters. In an instant, they were covered in heavy chunks of glittering ice, frozen to the ground. Before they could topple over, they'd been frozen while they were moving, so they were off balance. Todoroki rushed under them. Izuku followed his. A few other students did as well. The robots crashed down behind them, shooting a wave of freezing air and shards of ice and metal in every direction. Above him, Izuku saw Bakugo blast his way over the robots, ignoring them completely in favor of taking the lead. Thankfully, he ignored everyone as well. Instead, he sped after Todoroki, who was leaving a trail of ice in his wake as he propelled himself forward. On the other side was a horde of smaller robots, numbers painted on their arms to show how many points they were worth. Leftovers from the hero course's entrance exam, then. The one-pointers were relatively small. As one rushed at Izuku, he realized they were slow as well. It lunged for him, its bulky body barely able to get off the ground. Izuku ducked out of the way without much trouble. Despite the heavy workload that his classes had piled on him, Izuku had stuck to a trimmed training routine. To keep up with his work, he'd had to reduce his runs. One in the morning and another at night to only one in the evening. Still, he'd built up an impressive amount of endurance since when he'd started in junior high. Now, he could feel his blood pumping, but for the amount of time he'd been exerting himself, he felt good. On the ground were a few intact pieces of the zero-pointer's armor. Although there was a minuscule chance they'd prove useful in the next obstacles, it wasn't worth the risk. There was no way to carry them easily, and lugging around a piece of metal that was half as tall as he was and equally wide would slow him down. He passed the pieces by and spun out of reach of another one-pointer. It didn't follow him, too busy reaching for another student. Present Mick's voice filled the stadium, describing the next obstacle. So somebody had already gotten there. The next obstacle was a bottomless ravine only crossable by way of ropes, it seemed. So Izuku would have to do what most others would do: crawl. Izuku skidded to a stop, eyes shooting upwards at the two-pointer turning to roll towards him. It was much taller than the one-pointer, its clawed fingers flexing as it prepared an attack. Its wheels squealed as they moved along the uneven ground. It ran over rocks and pieces of its fellow robots as it approached. As it drew closer to Izuku, a group of other students passed without gaining its attention. It lashed out, right arm aimed at Izuku's face. He barely had time to throw himself out of the way. He tumbled into a roll that left his side aching and probably split open his most recent cuts, but he scrambled back up and broke into a run as it swiped at his back. It just barely missed. Then it jerked into action to follow him, much faster than the one-pointer had been. Izuku dove out of the way, and as he whipped his head around to see what was coming next, he saw the robot nearly tumble. So it was fast but unable to maintain its balance. Well, that was something Izuku could use. Izuku threw himself into a sprint. He looked over his shoulder to ensure the two-pointer was following. When he deemed himself far enough away, he slowed ever so slightly, and the robot took the chance to increase its speed. Just as it was about to grab him, Izuku dove to the side, ducking into a shoulder roll that hurt much less than the one he'd attempted the first time. The robot tried to follow, but the sudden turn sent it toppling over. Dust billowed out from under its body as it slammed into the ground. Climbing to his feet, Izuku was off again. His side ached when he inhaled, but it wasn't enough to slow him down. Todoroki and Bakugo had long since disappeared, and Izuku saw no sign of Shinso or Uraraka or Kirano. From his perspective, Izuku seemed to be passing quite a few people, but those were only the ones whose quirks weren't suited for their current situation. Most of the Hero Corps students, who he recognized from glancing over at their tables in the cafeteria, were already far ahead of him. And, considering the qualifier eliminated all but 42 students and there were 40 Hero Corps students, Izuku probably wasn't doing well. The next obstacle appeared ahead, complete with pillars jutting up from the darkness that were connected with thick ropes. Logically, he knew the school must have found a way to cushion the fall. Still, the fact remained the same that falling from the ropes would mean instant elimination. Ahead of him, standing at the edge, was a girl covered in support items over her PE uniform. A grappling hook shot out of a metal piece attached to her belt, and as a small crowd around her watched, her boots started to slide along the ground. Izuku hadn't been aware that support items were allowed in certain circumstances. If he had to take a guess, he'd assume they were allowed as long as they were made by the person wearing them. Because they certainly weren't necessary to control her quirk. And Present Mike would have called her out for breaking the rules if she wasn't following them. She slid off the edge and into the ravine, swinging down and stretching her arms and legs out like she was on a ride at an amusement park. When she was close enough to the pillar she'd latched onto with the grappling hook, she swung her legs forwards. Just before she crashed, her boots stopped her from hitting the rock. Then she was propelled upwards. Todoroki and Bakugo were far in front of her, easily clearing the final stretch of the ravine by either sliding across the ropes with ice or blasting over each drop. They both set down at the end of the obstacle at the same time. As they ran, they pushed and shoved at each other to try to take the lead. Just behind them were a few members of their class. Gritting his teeth, Izuku scanned the ravine in front of him, taking note of the fastest route he could take. With that memorized, he crouched down and grabbed the rope. He took a breath and let himself fall. Wrapping his arms around the rope to keep himself from plummeting down, he swung underneath it. He pulled himself across, rope under his crossed calves. The rope bounced as he moved, but there wasn't much wind to throw him off, at least. He reached the end of the first rope and turned to grab the side of the pillar. It crumbled as his fingers tightened around it. He dropped. He caught himself with his other hand, which was now burning from the sting of the rope's coarse fibers. Twisting around, he was able to put a hand on the flat top of the pillar and heave himself onto its solid platform. His ribs ached and his lungs burned. The damage he'd taken from hitting the ground to avoid that one-pointer was starting to take effect. Still, he ignored the pain. Clambering to his feet, he started again. When he was halfway across, he heard Present Mick's voice again, describing the next obstacle, a minefield. That, of course, would not be something Izuku would be particularly skilled at clearing. But it was something Bakugo could clear easily, and depending on how sensitive the mines were, Todoroki might be able to clear it with his ice under his boots. Izuku was on the last rope now, but as he turned to look at where his other competitors were, he saw two climb over the edge from their ropes and start their run to the final obstacle. Though he couldn't get a clear view from where he was, he knew there were plenty of contestants already at the minefield through Present Mick's commentary. The crowd was even louder now, clearly cheering on whoever was about to take first place. Just as Izuku was about to reach for the edge of the cliff, the rope jerked to the side. He nearly tumbled to his demise. But he held on. When he turned to look back at the cause, he saw a student on the other end of the rope. She was struggling to move, wrenching the rope side to side as she tried and failed to pull herself across. With the rope so unstable, Izuku could only grip the jagged edge of the cliff. If he tried to lift himself up as he'd been doing, the rope would pull out from under him and he'd fall. Present Mick's voice boomed louder than ever before, announcing that Bakugo had taken first place and Todoroki had taken a close second. The rope stopped jerking. With a sharp inhale, Izuku threw himself at the edge of the cliff. He gripped it with all the strength he could muster and prayed the rock under his fingers wouldn't crumble. His shoes scraped helplessly against the side of the ravine. With a burst of strength he hoped would be enough, he pushed himself up, muscles straining against his own weight. He stopped. His arms couldn't move him any farther. But before he could give in and let himself fail, he gave one last attempt and threw his leg over the side. From there, he slid his body to safety. Flipping over onto his back, he desperately essayed in air. Third and fourth and fifth and sixth place all disappeared before he caught his breath. Struggling to his feet, Izuku ignored the way his lungs screamed at him to stop. He started to run again, too tired to sprint but too determined to jog. Present Mike announced the competitors who took 7th and 8th and 9th place. By the time he reached the minefield, 26 places had been taken. It was nothing more than a field that was littered with ditches and mounds of dirt that the landmines had created. The most damage was contained in the middle of the field, clearly where the majority had decided to run. There were at least 24 competitors tiptoeing around the landmines that had yet to go off or attempting to evade the mines entirely by using a path of ice Todoroki must have created earlier. 3 competitors had made it to the end of the field. When they hit the safety of a path devoid of landmines, they ran leisurely with the knowledge they'd be in the second round. 27th and 28th and 29th place gone. He spotted Shinso on the other end, only meters from the final stretch. As soon as he set foot on the path to the race's exit gate, he looked over his shoulder, eyes scanning over the field. When he met Izuku's eyes, all he did was stare. Izuku understood. He nodded, and Shinso accepted the answer. He turned and started back towards the exit, overtaking another competitor who had cleared the field seconds after him. 30th and 31st place gone. From the looks of it, Todoroki's ice was more trouble than it was worth. Nearly half those trying to use the narrow path were sprawled out on the ground or flailing their arms out to keep from slipping. For Todoroki to run on the ice so effortlessly, his boots had to be cleated, and Izuku's worn red sneakers absolutely were not. So he took off into the middle of the minefield, figuring it was a decent bet. As he leapt from mound to mound of upturned dirt, he increased his speed, chest burning. He overtook a few competitors who were taking a moment to catch their breaths. But there were still so many in front of him. 34th and 35th place gone. With a burst of power, Izuku flew into a longer jump. Only when he was centimeters from touching down did he see the telltale circular patch of an untouched mine. All he could do was throw his head forwards as his foot landed, hoping the momentum of the controlled explosion would propel him forwards and not backwards. The ground ruptured under his foot, dirt blasting in every direction, and the force sent Izuku tumbling headfirst through the air. Where he was going to land, the ground was fairly even. No landmines to hurl him in a different direction. He hit the ground on his upper back, rolling to reduce but certainly not neutralize the pain. He was glad he'd bandaged his cuts well the night before, or else the blood would be seeping through his pea uniform. The momentum was enough to pull him to his feet immediately, and he didn't hesitate to speed up into a desperate sprint. He was halfway across now, but he hadn't caught up. 36th and 37th place gone. In his path up ahead, a lone mine sat untouched under the earth. Izuku took a deep breath before timing his jump. His heel connected with the edge of the circular mark of the mine, and the force sent him flying straight to the path beyond the minefield. Scrambling to his feet after a particularly brutal tumble, Izuku pushed his legs to carry him just a little farther. 38th and 39th place gone. And 40th place was Izuku's, as he passed through the dark hallway and into the sunlight once more. The crowd roared as the final passing contestants came in, and when the 42nd cleared the end of the hallway, another wave of confetti, there was already plenty on the ground, rained from cannons along the bottom edge of the stands. Would the crowd still be cheering if he had used his quirk to win? His body was on fire, his shoulder blade and his upper back were aching from the rolls, and his hands still burned from the memory of the ropes he'd pulled himself across with. But he was moving on to the next round, and he hadn't had to use his quirk, and that was what mattered. No amount of pain was going to stop him from crying with a stupid grin on his face. Swiping at his eyes to clear away his tears, he scanned the contestants that were standing farther from the hallway. His eyes caught Shinso's mass of fluffy hair over the head of the girl who was covered in support items. As soon as he'd wiped away the last of his tears, he made his way over to Shinso, waving as soon as his classmate caught sight of him. Shinso didn't bother waving back, but he did take a couple of steps towards Izuku to meet him in the middle. Cut it close. Izuku half grimaced, half grinned. I know. But why? Midoriya, Uraraka's voice called, waving to him as she jogged over. You made it. Before he could respond, there was a firm hand on his shoulder, and Izuku jumped but didn't instinctually wrench away from her grip, alerted by a voice behind him before he'd been touched. Immediately, the hand let go. When Izuku checked to see if anyone else had noticed, he cringed. Shinso and Uraraka were staring at him, faces both concerned but one scarcely noticeable and the other far more obvious. Behind him, Kirano blinked at her hand, checking her claws like she thought she'd accidentally pricked him. Sore, I'm sorry, Izuku said, eyes downcast but watching the three's hands at their sides. He resisted the urge to snake his fingers under the sleeve of his uniform and dig into the flesh on his upper arm. Something? It's not personal. I'm sorry. The following silence made Izuku squirm, but he couldn't find the voice to fill it. Shinso sighed and asked the two, Who are you? Izuku shot him a grateful look, to which Shinso kept his face blank, but Izuku knew he'd seen it. As the two introduced themselves, he let his shoulders relax partially. When they finished their explanations and Shinso solely offered his name in return, Izuku smiled and said, I'm glad you all made it. Same, Kirano said. But you might want to rank a little higher this round if you want to get noticed. Izuku grinned awkwardly. I know. Midnight cut their conversation short. Now, the real fun begins. As she had the first round, she raised her whip and pointed to the screen. Let's see what we have in store for you next. On the screen, a selection of events spun and spun, giving the illusion that the event would be randomly chosen. Of course, the next event had already been determined, as they had to set up for each. But that didn't provide any comfort. The wheel's spin slowly died down until the board displayed the words cavalry battle. Well, that was new. As far as Izuku knew, this was the first time UA had used a cavalry battle as one of its sports festival events, which meant it was either new or hadn't been used in 2 decades. And he wouldn't lie, he'd never been a fan of cavalry battles. Well, actually, he wasn't a fan of the concept. He'd never actually participated in one. In his junior high's sports festivals, his classmates had refused to let him anywhere near them. Well, the only person, besides Bakugo, aware of his quirk was happy to spar with him, and nobody else should be averse to touching him if they didn't know what his quirk was. But he doubted he could get away with dodging the question now. What would he do if nobody would team up with him because of his quirk? They couldn't possibly disqualify him if nobody would partner with him, could they? Or maybe people would partner up with him, thinking he wouldn't take their quirks if they appeased him? Biting his tongue, Izuku forced himself to focus on Midnight's voice as she began her explanation. Each person would receive a headband with a certain number of points, starting from 42nd place with 5 points, 41st place with 10 points, and so on. All headbands in a team would be handed off to the rider of the group, who could wear them either around their neck or forehead. Contestants could use their quirks to aid them, as long as they didn't purposely harm anyone severely. At the end of the round, which would be 15 minutes long, the 4 teams with the most points would move on to the final event. As she explained the rules, Izuku tried to build a potential team in his head. He ignored the nagging thought that everyone he asked would turn him down or laugh in his face. Teams could be made of 2 to 4 members, but a team of 4 would be much more likely to succeed. But where would he find so many teammates? At the end of her explanation, Midnight stopped, holding her breath to increase the buildup for whatever she was about to say. Then, she opened her mouth and revealed first place would have not 210 points but rather 10 million, and Izuku's mind stuttered to a stop. Even with 10 million points, Bakugo would have no trouble finding teammates. No, He would create a team of the classmates he deemed worthy to be his comrades, and he wouldn't settle for running away like any other team would do. With that many points, he was guaranteed a win if he held on to them. But Bakugo was himself. He would fight to take points from the other teams, and Izuku had a feeling his team, if he found one to be a part of, would be Bakugo's prime target. After all, Izuku had no right to stand on the same playing field as him. If his partners didn't run after he explained his quirk, would they run after he explained what Bakugo would undoubtedly do? Well, if they weren't afraid of him enough to leave, Izuku doubted Bakugo would be what made them reconsider. Still, the only person Izuku could think of who might possibly be his partner was Shinso, but they weren't enough to face Bakugo. Nobody was enough to face him, really. Still, if they wanted to have a chance of survival, they would need 2 more partners. But Izuku was confident that Uraraka and Kirano would partner up with their classmates. "Midoriya," Shinso said, his voice louder than usual. He wasn't yelling, because Shinso never took the effort to yell, but it was close. His lips were pursed together in a tight, subtle frown. "You're mumbling." Izuku swallowed harshly, squeezing his eyes shut for a second before reopening them. "I'm sorry. This is a lot of pressure, huh?" He chuckled, but it wasn't convincing and he resisted the urge to bite into his cheek for it. Well, who are you guys going to partner with?" "I'm gonna go find my classmates," Kirano said. "I know their quirks the best, so it'll be easier." Her logic was better than what he'd been thinking, which he knew was stupid, because he'd never told her his quirk. And she hadn't been around him often enough to grow tired of him yet. Probably. Unless she was. Lying, that is, but Izuku didn't see her as the type to lie solely to spare someone's feelings. "I think it'll be best to partner with my classmates too," Uraraka said softly. "Sorry. No, I mean of course," Izuku said, waving his hands in front of him. "I understand. I'd do the same." Both she and Kirano left, one giving them a little wave and the other a mock salute. "You and me," Shinso drawled. Izuku turned to him, eyebrows furrowed, and nearly whispered, "What?" Shinso gave him a look that told him he wouldn't be repeating himself, as Izuku had obviously heard him. So Izuku continued, "You'd really partner with me?" "One condition." "A condition? What is it?" "You've to use your quirk." Izuku inhaled sharply. "Well, yes, I should use it if it's necessary, but if it's not." There was no reason he needed to use his quirk. Well, yes, there was. He knew he needed to use it, but what would everyone think of him when he did? What would his victim think, and what would his peers think, and what would the audience think? And if he used his quirk, that would make Bakugo hate him all that much more. Then they'd be in bigger trouble and they wouldn't have any chance of winning. "It barely got here," Shinso said, glaring. "I know. But if I use my quirk, everyone will," he trailed off. "Wouldn't it be villainous, using my quirk to succeed when it ruins someone else's chances of winning?" "I'm a villain?" "Of course not," Izuku said. How did Shinso draw that conclusion? Brainwashed people last round. That's different. How? Izuku bit into his tongue until he tasted blood, then relaxed his jaw. Your quirk isn't villainous. People only think that because of what you could do with it, not what you actually do. He bit down on the tip of his tongue again, opening the wound wider, as he let his nails dig into his palms. But when I use mine, it always hurts people. I'll hurt people. Entrance exam, Shinso said. Tried to sabotage people. It's not villainous. But you had to. If you wanted to succeed, you had to use your quirk. You'd be in the hero course. If you'd used your quirk. But I couldn't just take away someone's quirk. Izuku said. They wouldn't have stood a chance in the exam without one. Shinso scowled. I can spare enemies. But they wouldn't have been my enemies, Izuku pressed, voice cracking. They just wanted the same thing I wanted. I'd be taking away their chances at their ideal futures. And I'd be taking a piece of who they were. I take free will. You take a piece. Mine's worse. Izuku opened his mouth to retort, but he closed it, staring down at Shinso's feet. When he felt tears sting at his eyes, he put his hand over his mouth to hide the way his lips wobbled. Their quirks were different. They both could take away a person's will, a person's hopes, a person's dreams, sure. But they were different, because Shinso's quirk wasn't villainous, because Shinso only used it because he had to succeed. Izuku's quirk was villainous, and he couldn't dare to use it, because what kind of person would he be if he did? Using it would make him the monster everyone always thought he was. Using it would mean nobody would trust him and that they had every right not to. Our quirks read the same. They're not. They say, "Stop beaching and use it," Shinso barked. Izuku snapped his mouth shut, fully confident it was his best option. If he stayed still and didn't argue and didn't make a sound, Shinso would calm down. Shinso crouched down and inhaled and exhaled audibly. "It isn't villainous. I said mine wasn't." Now, if Izuku didn't talk, he'd find himself in more trouble. "But they're different. Yours villainous and mine's not?" Shinso asked. Izuku said nothing. "Bullshit. But Izuku started. Can stop villains quick. For they hurt anyone," Shinso finished. "But our opponents here aren't villains," Izuku said, his voice still soft. It was trembling as well, ever so slightly, but he couldn't stamp it down. Even when Izuku focused on the ache of all the injuries he'd sustained in the first round, he couldn't stop himself from crying. He wanted to dig his nails into his left shoulder, where he'd cut the night before at the thought of having to use his quirk during the festival. But Shinso would notice, so he kept his fists by his sides. He dug hard into his palms and bit the tip of his tongue. He had to bite his tongue, because biting his cheek would be more obvious. And if Shinso noticed the blood, accidentally biting his tongue during the first event would be believable. Hero course teachers need to see it. Izuku sniffled and swiped his wrist across his nose, grimacing at the wet feeling on his skin as he wiped the snot away. As he rubbed the back of his wrist on his pants, he nodded but didn't meet Shinso's eyes, knowing his face must have looked pitiful. It was true if he didn't use his quirk during the second or third events, the hero course teachers wouldn't know what it was by watching him. No, only All Might would know personally. The rest would know only by the information ectoplasm had given them, and what if they assumed he thought himself too good to use it? He'd already refused to use his quirk during the first event, when he could have cleared easily with the right, if right was the correct word, selection. He'd almost failed because of it. If he wanted to make up for his less-than-ideal performance in the first round, he needed his quirk in the second. Refusing to use it in the second as well could cement his fate as a permanent member of the general course. Honestly, he should count himself lucky if they hadn't disregarded him already. And what about All Might, up in the stands, watching Izuku do so poorly because he was refusing to use a quirk that the pro had said wasn't villainous? A quirk that he'd encouraged Izuku to use to try for the hero course? What was he doing, convincing himself he didn't need to use his quirk? Izuku glanced up to meet Shinso's glower and reluctantly said, "I'll try." Shinso rose up, looking away as Izuku wiped away the last remnants of his tears. His eyes would still be red and puffy, but Izuku couldn't do much to fix that. From what he could see, most had already grouped into teams of 4, and when he risked a glance at the timer on the screen above midnight, it read 8.5 minutes remaining. They'd had 15. Izuku started to apologize for wasting so much time, but Shinso rolled his eyes and turned away from him as soon as the first few words had left his mouth. He started off in what Izuku assumed was a random direction. As he walked away, Izuku resisted the urge to dig his nails into his shoulder once again. Whatever relationship he and Shinso had had was ruined now, wasn't it? Izuku wasn't sure he could have called them friends, as he didn't know what Shinso would call them, and he refused to make the mistake of deeming someone a friend when they weren't. Not that he believed Shinso would treat him the same way Bakugo did. But just because he didn't seem to mind Izuku's quirk didn't mean he didn't mind Izuku using it on him. Gritting his teeth, Izuku dug his nails into his injured shoulder. The sting it brought was almost comforting. Wherever they stood didn't matter at the moment. What did matter was moving on to the third round. If their team failed, neither of them would have made any impression on the hero course teachers. If he kept standing there, he would accomplish nothing but wasting more time. What he could do now was help Shinso look for partners and attempt to create a plan that might just let them win. Because they would need partners to have any chance against Bakugo. And use his quirk if it would ensure them victory. If he didn't use his quirk during the second event, he'd be setting himself up for failure in the eyes of the hero course teachers whether their team passed or not. If they failed because Izuku refused to use his quirk, he would be ruining Shinso's chances of making it to the next round, if not anyone else's, too. And was that not the same as letting down victims of a villain when he refused to take that villain's quirk if he ever became a pro? He could keep a good conscience if he failed because he refused to use his quirk, but he'd lose it the second someone else failed because of him. Either he refused to use his quirk and aided the other teams, thereby hurting his own team, or used his quirk and harmed the other teams to help his own. In the end, he would lose either way. He sniffled one last time and lifted his head up to scan the field for anyone still searching for a partner. Shinso had already disappeared behind the sea of other contestants. But Izuku knew he'd gone left, so he turned right and slipped around each group who were already planning their strategies. Just as he cleared the worst of the crowd, skin crawling, the girl who'd been covered in support items in the first round skidded to a stop in front of him. She just about launched herself in his direction. Her face stopped centimeters from his, and Izuku flinched back and nearly fell. "Are you in the general course? Please tell me you are. I've been searching forever," she whined. She didn't acknowledge Izuku's reaction to her approach, though he suspected it was because she hadn't noticed. Up close, Izuku could differentiate between each item she was wearing, though he could only guess at the applications of about half. She wore steampunk goggles pushed up to her forehead, a headpiece with tubes curled up like horns around her head, and acheronsis around her chest and middle that held something to her back that he couldn't see. She was still wearing the boots she'd used during the first round. She had set down a small trunk behind her legs, which he assumed held more support items. "I am," Izuku said. "Great," she said, grinning from ear to ear as she brushed a pink dreadlock out of her eyes. She was nearly shouting, but that seemed to be her natural volume. "You're trying to transfer into the hero course, right? Most general course students barely put in the effort to make it halfway through the first round." That's right. Then team up with me. We can help each other. I want all my babies to get noticed by the support companies up there," she said, gesturing to the sections in the stands that were full of men and women in suits. "And you want to get noticed by the hero course teachers. I assume you'll be trying to make yourself stand out in this round." So he'd been right about her making the support items herself. Izuku stopped himself before he could ask why she wouldn't ask Bakugo to team up with her. Surely Bakugo would stand out more than Izuku. But she most likely had asked already, and Bakugo had probably declined in a more than impolite manner that made Izuku cringe just imagining it. Bakugo. What could Izuku ever do against him? Support girl might join his team, and maybe it would help against other teams, but against Bakugo? Could anyone ever help them stand against Bakugo? "The name's Mei Hatsum, by the way," she continued, not at all deterred by Izuku's lack of response. She grabbed the trunk and plopped it down in front of her, crouching down to open it. "I packed a ton of powerful babies, so I'm sure you'll find something you like floating around my arsenal." "Oh, I'm Izuku Midoriya." She produced some sort of backpack from the trunk and shoved it into his hands. If he hadn't been watching her, and if he hadn't seen her stance shift before she turned to shove it toward him, he would have jerked away. Instead, he caught it as she let it go. Immediately, she returned to digging around in the trunk while he stared down at the compact metal box in his arms. "Nice to meet you. Though I won't remember your name. Now, what you need is something to watch your back while you go after other teams. Just keeping your points won't be enough, considering you don't really have any," she said. There wasn't any amusement in her voice, she was just stating a fact without a care of what the implications were. "What you're holding right now is what I like to call the Iron Spider. It uses sensors to cover your blind spots, so you can focus on what's in front of you while it guards your back. It's perfect for what you're trying to do, I'll bet. So what's your quirk?" Izuku tensed, his abused muscles protesting the action. It took him a while to work up the nerve to even open his mouth, but the fact that she still didn't bother looking up at him even when he went silent made it easier for him to force out, I can take quirks from other people." She turned to stare at him then, a strangely shaped gun in her hands. Izuku glanced behind him, ready to freeze or flee. She merely stood up, and her face lit up with excitement. Do you know how many support items I could make for you depending on which quirk you have? Think you could take a few permanently so my babies wouldn't go to waste? When you become a hero student, make sure to stop by 1HS Studio, and I'll fix you up with something awesome. Izuku blinked, unable to respond. But can just see up to 5 kilometers away. Not exactly useful for this type of thing. Or really anything, she laughed. For a second, Izuku wondered if that was the reason she didn't seem afraid of him. If he took her quirk, it didn't appear she would mind much. Still, that didn't make sense, as even his classmates in elementary and junior high school with quirks that weren't particularly useful wanted him to touch them. Before Izuku could try to think up another reason, Hatsum presented him with the oddly shaped gun she'd been holding. This baby is my quad blaster. It shoots cartridges that release capture nets. It can shoot 3 nets before it needs to be reloaded. She paused, stuck her head back in her trunk, and rummaged around. Looks like I left the extra cartridges in the studio. That's my bad. Ignoring the fact that the gun's name didn't make much sense, Izuku said, that would still be a really big help, actually. And your iron spider. Right? So let's team up. Got any other teammates in mind? Izuku glanced behind him, but Shinso was nowhere to be found. Oh, I do actually. We need to go find him. He's in the general course too. Perfect. As Izuku led the way in the direction he'd last seen Shinso, he checked the clock. He beat down a rush of panic when he read only 5 minutes remaining. They moved through the crowd as quickly as they could. Izuku kept his head up, searching for Shinso's hair. When he saw it on the other side of the field, he motioned for Hatsum to follow with his head, since his arms were still full. Eventually, they moved out into a more open area, where he could see Shinso talking to one of their classmates. It was Kirikyu, the boy with the quite literal icy appearance who Izuku had taken notice of on the first day. Though they occasionally sat at the same table during lunch, it was odd sitting next to people during lunch, but his class was still oblivious to his quirk, so there was no glaring reason to avoid him. They knew little more than each other's names and motivations for joining the general course. Which was why it was strange to see he'd made it to the second event. Kirikyu had no intention of transferring like Shinso or Izuku did, though he had mentioned how much he hated how the general course received so little attention. Shinso, Kirikyu, Izuku greeted, mainly to alert them of his presence. Shinso kept his eyes on Hatsum, who was standing at Izuku's side. Who are you? Mei Hatsum, she said, shoving herself into Shinso's face just the same as she'd done with Izuku. He stared back at her with a frown, leaning back slightly so their noses wouldn't touch. And you are? Shinso. She, wants to be on our team. She's in the support course, so she can use all the support items she brought, and some of them seem like they'll be a really big help. And, Kirikyu, are you? Yeah, I'll be on your team, he said. He huffed a laugh. A team of only non-hero course students. If we can pull this off, it'll be a pretty big upset. It'll definitely be something to take note of, Izuku supplied, catching Shinso's subtle smirk right before it disappeared. Since we'll have to steal other headbands to get enough points. Izuku paused, bringing a hand to his chin. For a moment, he couldn't start up again, but his teammates had a right to know. Well, not, necessarily. The Bakugo will probably try to take everyone's points. He won't just settle for the 10 million points he has. He'll still go on the offense, so maybe if we can just avoid him, we'll be able to move on to the next round, because I really don't think we'll be able to fight him fairly, since he's, well, the guy who got first place? You know him? Kirikyu asked. Izuku hoped the grimace he made wasn't obvious. Yeah, kind of. And you think he'll take everyone else's points? I think so. He's not the type to go on the defensive. He has to win, and when he wins, he wants it to be by the largest margin possible. So he'll go after everyone's points, probably. Especially ours. Izuku couldn't help but move his hand from his chin to cover his mouth and nose. He doesn't like me all that much, so I'm afraid he'll target us specifically, probably towards the end of the round when we won't have time to steal back any points. And he's strong, obviously. Really strong. Why doesn't he like you? Izuku didn't suppose there was any use attempting to lie. As soon as Bakugo targeted him specifically, Shinso would draw the same conclusion whether Izuku spoke up now or not. So, in the end, Izuku needed to quickly reveal his quirk, hope Kirikyu didn't leave because of it, and hurry through their basic strategy. They needed to prepare for Bakugo. And, at least with this, Izuku could transition into the concept of his quirk. Though he was introducing it through the idea that somebody already hated him for it, so maybe it wasn't as convenient as he would have liked. But it truly didn't matter, as he would have had to say it eventually. He'd made a promise to Shinso, and he wasn't going to ruin his teammates' chances of success to protect himself. He, doesn't like my quirk. Which is? With his hand still covering his mouth, Izuku said, can take other people's quirks. He forced his line of sight up so he'd be able to gauge Kirikyu's reaction. Then he forced out, and used them for myself. Kirikyu huffed. I can see why he wouldn't like that, he said, his voice abnormally calm. No panic, no fear, no backing away, no calling him a villain. No, just an elusive edge of hesitation in his words that stemmed from apprehension. In a way, it was better than Hatsume's reaction. While Hatsume had seemed to grow even more excitable at the mention of his quirk, Kirikyu grew hesitant. That was to be expected. It was what he should have done. It was almost better because he was reacting in a genuine way, but he was trying to suppress his fear to avoid provoking Izuku. And that was what everyone would do if Izuku became a hero. They would see him as a villain, and he would fight to prove that he was different, that he was good, that he could be trusted. And one day they might just trust him. That was all he could ask for. Still, is that really worth hating someone for? It's not like you had any say in it, Kirikyu continued. Izuku frowned, confused. You didn't take his quirk and never give it back, did you? No. I couldn't. So he's just an but, Kirikyu said. Shinso snorted. After shooting Shinso and Hatsume an apologetic look, Izuku offered, still, if you don't want to partner with me because of my quirk, I understand. Midoriya, Shinso warned. Before Izuku could apologize, Kirikyu said, why would I not want to partner with you for that? Your quirk might actually come in handy. Think about it. Why not just take Bakugo's quirk? Because if Izuku did, Bakugo might actually kill them all. Kirikyu continued, my quirk's called Frost Breath. It's pretty self-explanatory. My breath is cold enough to freeze things if I want it to. It can hurt people if I breathe directly onto their skin, so it's better if I breathe on the ground or at someone's feet. But I can only use it about 3 or 4 times before I can't breathe in deep enough to use it properly. But if I got tired, you could take it and we could get more shots out of it. I mean, Izuku trailed off. Was Kirikyu just attempting to appease him? I won't take it if you don't want me to. I offered, didn't I? It's fine as long as you give it back. Midoriya, is your quirk activated by skin contact? Hatsume interjected. He nodded to Kirikyu, then to Hatsume. Then you should be the rider. That way you'll be able to use any of our quirks plus anyone else who's stupid enough to get close to you. Izuku glanced at the timer. 2 minutes remained. If they didn't hurry, they wouldn't have a plan for defending themselves against Bakugo. They would lose before they ever had a chance to stand out in the crowd. Well, they would stand out, but not for the reason they wanted. They really needed to hurry. Shinso, Hatsume, can you tell us what your quirks are again? Just so everyone knows. As soon as they'd finished explaining their quirks, he continued, the board says we have 105 points in all. Most teams will end up with 0 points by the end of the round. Hopefully. But we won't be safe unless we take some headbands from the other teams. And that assumes we keep our points. Using my babies will help, Hatsume said. She turned to Izuku. You wear the Iron Spider. And you'll have to hold the quad blaster too, since the rest of us will have our hands full. Izuku nodded hesitantly, fitting the pack around his shoulders as quickly as he could and ignoring the pressure it put on the wounds on his shoulder. It'll activate automatically after you press the button on the left side. Kirikyu should be in the front, since it'll give him a wider range of places to use it without putting us in danger, I think. Right? And Hatsume and Shinso, you guys could take the back, if that works? And Hatsume, would it be better to take your boots off? If only you have them, I don't think we'll be able to use them as a team, and they're hard to walk in, right? Is that okay? Her shoulders dropped in visible dismay as she agreed, and she knelt down to undo the straps that connected her calves to the boots. At the same time, Shinso and Kirikyu agreed to their positions. Izuku once again checked the timer on the screen. Only a little over a minute remaining. We need to prepare for Bakugo, Izuku blurted. Izuku didn't miss the way Shinso's eyes narrowed, and he knew exactly what Shinso was thinking. It made his heartbeat stutter and speed up its rhythm, but how could he not mention Bakugo again? So what did it matter if Shinso suspected Bakugo's and his relationship was less than ideal? In the end, it wouldn't matter. Soon enough they'd know for certain. They would figure out that Bakugo had hurt him, that Izuku couldn't defend himself, that he was weak, that he had every right to leave covered in scars because he couldn't even convince himself to use his quirk to help his allies. Because he'd needed Shinso, who was most likely only on his team because he was too lazy to find someone else, to convince him to aid his own teammates. But there was no stopping Bakugo, because he did whatever he wished when he wished, and he was right to do so because it was Izuku he was attacking. Would Izuku never be a hero, because he couldn't even come up with a strategy to protect his teammates from certain failure, because he couldn't think of anything but Bakugo's quirk on his skin? Because he knew Bakugo would come for them, and all he could do was think about his flesh melting instead of what was important? They were going to lose, and it would be his fault, because he was the one Bakugo was after, because he couldn't think of a strategy in time, because he couldn't. What about the other teams? Kirikyu asked. Izuku's eyes flicked over to the sound of Kirikyu's voice, smooth and soft like fresh snow rather than frost. He ran a hand through his hair and dug his nails into his scalp for a split second. What was he doing, wasting precious time? Well, Bakugo, I know he'll come after us, Izuku said. But I bet at least a few teams will go after Bakugo's 10 million, especially if they're in Class 1B and haven't yet seen him in action. The one advantage we might have is that none of us are Hero Corps students. Nobody will expect us to put up much of a fight, so we won't be seen as a threat that needs to be taken out. But that's also a disadvantage. If we're not seen as a threat, there will probably be a few teams who come after us to take our few points before disregarding us entirely. We could try to take advantage of that and let our points be taken early on, and then we wouldn't be targeted, and then we could take back enough to move on when time is about to run out. But that's awfully risky. He glanced at the clock, heart stumbling. There's nothing we can do to stop Bakugo from targeting us. When he comes, I think the only The buzzer rang, booming across the stadium and echoing off its walls, and Midnight raised her whip and yelled, "Everyone, come get your headbands and get into position. The cavalry battle will begin in 30 seconds. They were going to lose. And it would be Izuku's fault." Their team scrambled into formation, and when Izuku was balanced, supported by his teammates' hands, he let his fingers slip underneath his right sleeve. He forced his nails down into his skin as far as they could go without drawing blood, pretending he was rubbing some soreness out of his shoulder. The pain distracted him from the itch under the skin of his feet. They were only touching his feet to hold him up, and his socks kept their skin from making direct contact. Even so, the discomfort didn't fade with something as unreasonable as logic. If he had spent his time searching for a teammate rather than attempting to convince himself Shinso was in the wrong, he might have been able to come up with a plan. Instead, he'd wasted their time. Now, he'd have to think of a plan during the event. But there was a slim chance he'd be able to relay any information to his teammates without distracting them from the other opponents they would have to face. And Izuku was the rider. He would be the one responsible for keeping an eye out for threats and potential targets. He could juggle it, he knew, but he couldn't jeopardize their team's need for points by muddling it with a plan to defend against Bakugo when he wasn't a current threat. If Izuku's position called for him to give instructions, he would have to do so. But they would have to be based on whatever threat was imminent. Izuku released the tension in his hand after one last burst that sent another bolt of pain through his shoulder. He brought his hand down to hit the button on the side of the iron spider, feeling it click under his fingertip. Then, he set his arms out in a more balanced position. "We just have to fight and take a bunch of headbands, right? With my babies, we can win easily," Hatsum crowed. "So let's just fight." "Sounds like a plan to me," Kirikyu said. Shinso nodded. Did they truly believe that was all they needed to do? Their tones made him think they did. The buzzer went off, loud enough to make Izuku's eardrums ring. Every team seemed to jump into action simultaneously. It was Bakugo and Todoroki's teams who moved faster than the rest. Though they had started on opposite ends of the stadium, they were already at each other's throats quite literally, as every rider's headbands were carefully tied around their necks. Ice and fire collided in a blast of blinding light, the blazes on Bakugo's palms reflecting on Todoroki's thorns of ice. Izuku's best bet would be to use his quirk on Bakugo. As awful as that idea was, Bakugo wouldn't keep his distance. He would assume Izuku wouldn't use his quirk on him. That Izuku wouldn't have the courage to. Scanning the electronic board above the press box that now displayed the teams, Izuku counted 11 in all. But before he could double-check, he felt his teammates tense under his feet. One team had branched away from the group they'd been near at the start of the round, now barreling towards Izuku's team. Izuku didn't recognize anyone on their four-person team, but he took note of their distinctive features. The rider had silver hair and an almost feathery crown surrounding his eyes, which could either be an eye mask or his eyelashes. His quirk wasn't obvious from his appearance, unfortunately. From his position, Izuku could see the left horse but not the right. The left's most distinguishing feature was his headband, as his hair and eyes were dark gray with no sign of a mutant-type quirk. Izuku couldn't take any guess at what his quirk could be. However, Izuku could assume the front horse had a quirk that warranted him a spot in the front. His tousled hair was the color of sand, and he had an impressive set of exposed teeth similar to ectoplasm but not quite as disconcerting. Though his teeth were what would catch someone's attention, Izuku doubted it was related to his quirk. It was more likely a feature he'd received from one of his parents. It didn't make sense for him to be up front if his quirk was merely increased jaw strength or something similar. Close-range quirks weren't particularly useful in a cavalry battle when one was a horse. "Kurikyu!" Izuku shouted, hoping his voice would carry over the roar of quirks clashing, contestants yelling, and the audience cheering. Kurikyu pulled his head back as he inhaled, then let his breath go in the direction of the front horse's feet. His team had just enough time to slow down, but not nearly enough time to dodge. Kurikyu's icy breath curled around the front horse's feet and formed little crystals around his shoes that left him stuck to the ground. But as he started to struggle, Izuku felt Shinso and Hatsum falter. Beneath his teammates' feet, the packed dirt was melting into mud. It pulled their legs into the ground. The ground had started to shift just beyond the front horse's toes. The quirk was Teeth Boy's. Could he solely turn the ground into a quicksand-like substance? Or was his quirk more general than that? In the bare field, Izuku doubted the specifics mattered. "I can't get out," Kurikyu shouted, Shinso grunting his agreement. "My ice won't hold him for much longer." Before Izuku could reply, he felt the iron spider were to life. It snapped open instantly. 4 metal spider legs all extended in the same direction. Izuku nearly fell forwards, instinctively flinching away from the sudden noise and movement. Luckily, his team remained unaffected by his misstep, considering they were still stuck. Still, he'd prefer not to make that mistake again. As long as he expected the reaction, he wouldn't flinch, so he vowed to keep the iron spider in the back of his mind. The spider legs blocked an attack from a girl whose quirk Izuku couldn't decipher from where he was. All he could see was a flesh-colored cord shooting in his direction and the iron spider knocking them out of the air. When the cord retreated, the spider legs folded back into the backpack. The pack's opening snapped shut. "The hell's your quirk?" Shinso called out to the front horse, who'd gotten 1 foot free from Kurikyu's ice. The boy snorted. "Wouldn't you like tea? Stop using your quirk. Stay still." The boy's eyes glazed over and his face went slack. Soon enough, the ground slowly morphed back into what it was before. As his team stumbled when the dirt shifted, the iron spider's legs creaked and shot out again. It knocked away another attack from the cords, which both ended in a silver point that resembled a headphone jack. They twisted and tried for another angle, and Izuku ducked down and raised his arms to guard his neck. The iron spider lashed out, forcing both to retreat. The headphone jacks belonged to a girl with straight purple hair much darker than Shinsu's, and upon closer inspection, Izuku saw that the jacks were attached to her earlobes. Above her was a floating headband, so Izuku could assume their rider had an invisibility quirk. Their team was circling around Izuku's, slowly getting closer as they moved. "Want to know what I did?" Shinso asked, smirking at the gray-haired rider in front of them. He was staring at the front horse, whose eyes were still glazed over. The others, from their positions, couldn't seem to shake Shinso's brainwashing off of him. The rider opened his mouth, only to shut it when the back horse in the headband hissed, "Don't respond. I think that's how his quirk works." Shinso huffed. "There's another team to our left headed for us," Izuku said, glancing from them to the rest of his surroundings. Bakugo and Todoroki were still locked in battle, but another team had joined the fray. Even so, the scoreboard still showed Bakugo's team with the 10 million. After checking the timer, Izuku scanned his surroundings again. If they were going to get points before Bakugo attacked them, now was their chance. Because Bakugo would come for them, and he'd make it personal. He'd be the one taking the headbands, obviously. Izuku would have to take his quirk while simultaneously defending against that. When Bakugo reached for his throat, he'd have to use one hand to take his quirk and use the other to swat his hand away. Without an explosion, it shouldn't be as difficult. Izuku continued, "But it looks like they're the only ones. I think we should retreat but maybe meet that team? The girl with the purple hair has a pretty useful long-range quirk, which isn't ideal, but they're not going to leave us alone. Do you guys think we should try for their points?" "Sounds good to me," Hatsum said. Shinso nodded. Entirely free from the mud, his team followed his suggestion. Together, they sped away. As they did, the back horse of the other team finally shook the front horse's shoulder forcefully enough. Blearily, he blinked Shinso's brainwashing away. Still, he was too disoriented to move immediately, and when his team did start to move, it was only to run into a net from the quad blaster. The team struggled to pull it away, clawing fruitlessly without any quirk that would help untangle them. The invisible person's team was much closer now, and the iron spider lashed out again and again to block the purple-haired girl's quirk. She was the front horse, with one back horse that had worryingly large lips and another with a rock-like head. Neither had a discernible quirk. Izuku raised both hands to guard his temples, figuring he didn't need to keep the quad blaster pointed at them and net wouldn't do much against the headphone jacks. In fact, he bent his knees and offered the quad blaster to Hatsum, explaining that it would be better for him to have both hands free. She took it, holding it by the grip with 2 fingers while keeping the rest on Korikyu's shoulder. Headphone Jack Girl could make it past the Iron Spider's defense, but if Izuku kept his arms by his face to cut down on time needed to move, he should be able to keep her from taking the headbands around his neck. Still, they would need to move much closer if they wanted to use Shinso's brainwashing on the rider. That would be putting their points at more risk, though. Maybe Izuku could grab the 2 headphone jacks and keep her from attacking again. Then they could move closer and Shinso could brainwash the rider. "Can we keep this amount of distance between our teams? From this far, I think I can deal with her quirk," Izuku said. Their team came to a rather abrupt stop before backing away, and Izuku put a hand on Korikyu's shoulder to steady himself once again, apologizing all the while. Invisible Person's team stopped as well, and Izuku tilted his head at them, squinting to make up for the fact he couldn't put a hand on his chin. "I think the purple-haired girl's quirk is the only useful quirk they have," Izuku said. Headphone Jack Girl's quirk came rushing towards them again, but the Iron Spider knocked them away. Izuku kept his eyes trained on their opponent's moves, his hands up by his head. If the back riders had useful long-range quirks, they'd be using them, I think. And if they have close-range quirks, they'd be trying to close the distance. The purple-haired girl's quirk wouldn't exactly be weak in close-range battles, after all, right? "So what does that mean?" Korikyu asked. "It means we should move forward." Hatsum chimed in. "Trust my baby. It'll keep us safe from that girl's quirk." From a shorter distance, Izuku didn't trust his reflexes nearly as much, but the Iron Spider hadn't failed him yet. Though, just like him, the spider legs would have less time to react from a closer range. Still, Izuku let out a shaky breath and said, "Right?" They began to close the distance between them. Unsurprisingly, the other team attempted to retreat. As they pursued Invisible Person's team, Izuku checked the timer. 11.5 minutes remaining. Behind them, Bakugo and Todoroki were still fighting, though the team Izuku had seen before had disappeared, most likely trying for an easier team. Izuku had a suspicion that, even when distracted by Todoroki's team, Bakugo had managed to drive off any other competition. After ensuring there weren't any other teams following them, Izuku turned back to the task at hand. They were closer now, and the Iron Spider's legs were scrambling to keep up with Headphone Jack Girl's quicker attacks. She attacked from every angle. She moved both Headphone Jacks separately in opposite directions, then pressed them together only to split when the Iron Spider lashed in one direction. When they'd gotten close enough for Quirk to aim another icy breath at Headphone Jack Girl's feet, she made it through the Iron Spider's defenses. Izuku swiped his hand out just in time to catch one of her headphone jacks. He kept the firmest grip he could muster around it, pulling it away from the headbands around his neck. Keeping the muscles in his arm pulled taut as she tried every method to struggle out of his grip, Izuku readied himself for the other headphone jack. It shot towards him in an arc over his head, but when two mechanical spider legs intercepted her, she pulled it back. Now, she turned her attention to the ice that kept her glued to the ground, but Izuku's team had already closed the gap between them. Mind handing those over? Shinso asked. You really think we'd do that? Headphone Jack Girl asked. Yeah, there's no way, a higher-pitched voice Invisible Girl's voice said. Don't move, Shinso said, eyes on Headphone Jack Girl, whose eyes dulled from black to light gray. Shinso flicked his eyes over to Invisible Girl's general direction and continued, take off all your headbands. Toss them to me. Though Shinso had told her to toss them to him, Izuku would be the one to catch the headbands. Shinso didn't have free hands to catch anything. There was no visible reaction from Invisible Girl at first, of course, but then the four headbands around her neck unraveled as the Velcro that connected both ends broke apart. In their position, the back horses couldn't reach them even if they snaked their arms out from under the rider, so the headbands went sailing over to Shinso without resistance. Izuku had to lean forward more than he would have liked to catch them. Just as the headbands were nearing Izuku's hands, he dropped the headphone jack. Now, even if the impact of hitting the ground dispelled Shinso's brainwashing, Headphone Jack Girl wouldn't have time to use her quirk to snatch the headbands back. He snagged the headbands around his fingers and fastened them around his neck as quickly as he could, pressing each headband's pieces of Velcro together. Just as he'd done with his own team's headbands, Izuku flipped over the new four so that the sides facing outwards were blank. And then they were off again, circling around the middle of the stadium where the other teams were battling. Up on the scoreboard, their team had moved from 8th place. A few teams had lost their headbands, moving up the ranks of teams that had done nothing but keep their original points to 5th place. Izuku had expected the jump despite not knowing the name of the rider, and therefore not knowing how many points that team had had from the scoreboard. Still, seeing their team's ranks slide up on the screen was almost proof that they had a chance. Especially while Bakugo and Todoroki's teams were still caught up fighting each other. But they wouldn't be fighting for much longer. When the time came, Bakugo would be too focused on Izuku to respond to anything Shinso said. And he couldn't assume Kiriku's quirk would work either. The front rider of Bakugo's team might be there because he could withstand Bakugo's explosions. His classmates had to know he would use his quirk despite them being so close. Even if the front rider couldn't, that wouldn't stop Bakugo. He'd do his best to avoid seriously injuring the rider, but he'd still use his quirk. His explosions would instantly melt any frost Quirk could produce. "Iku'd taken her quirk," Shinso called up to Izuku. Izuku tensed. He didn't even think to. I'm sorry. Bakugo might respond to Izuku. Shinso would be far more forgiving than Bakugo if Izuku took his quirk instead. Izuku could brainwash Bakugo and ask him to toss over the 10 million headband, then the rest. The 10 million first for both the sake of time and to ensure Izuku didn't drop it when attempting to catch many others. Luckily, we didn't really need it, Quirk said. But maybe don't forget next time. I'm sorry. I won't, Izuku said, his voice resolute. With that, he wiped his palm across the side of his shirt and took the quad blaster back from Hatsum, hoping the gun wouldn't slip from his, now less, sweaty hand. He glanced at the timer once more. We have about 7 minutes left, and we still don't have enough points to get us into the next round. But we're not that far behind the 4th place team, so any team with some headbands we find will probably have enough points to put us over the edge. Doesn't matter, Shinso said. He gestured with his head to their left. Sure enough, another team was rushing towards them. They sidestepped as the opposing team dashed past, though Izuku almost lost his balance in the process, as he didn't dare pull his hands away from his face to right himself. One of the back horses was Kirano, who was grinning, fangs showing. The back horse across from Kirano had skin as black as Eraserhead's hero costume, with shaggy gray hair that contrasted sharply against it. Their front horse's appearance was much more plain than the rest on his team, with no visible feature of his quirk and inexpressive black eyes. Kirano's team changed course and charged at them again. When they were close enough, Izuku aimed the quad blaster and fired. They nearly tripped over themselves in a rush to stop, but the net covered them all the same, draping over the rider's head and hanging down to the knees of the horses. The rider pushed at the ropes uselessly. Even when Kirano let go of the front horse's shoulder to help, the net never moved. That is, until the front horse took a deep breath and exhaled, his breath solidifying in midair and pushing against the net. At first, it resisted, but the bubble the front horse had created kept expanding. Eventually, the net curled around the bubble over the team's heads. With a shove from the rider, the bubble and net drifted away. Still, Kirikyu wasted no time in exhaling his own quirk-powered breath onto the front horse's feet. Rather than coating the horse's shoes, it left a frosty sheen on the ground below them. Nevertheless, it accomplished practically the same goal, as the front horse was trapped all the same unless he wanted to risk slipping. It wouldn't hold them long, but it was enough to keep them away for a few seconds. Mind handing those over? Shinso asked. The rider snorted, laughed, and said, "That's a little overconfident, don't you think?" Kirano huffed. "You're one to talk, Monoma." At the same time, the rider's Monoma's eyes paled, and he slowly pulled the headbands away from his neck at Shinso's command. As he did, Izuku chanced to look at the scoreboard and timer. Monoma's team was in 7th place. 5 minutes remaining. When Izuku turned back, the headbands were already in the air. But they didn't make it to his fingers. Instead, they were intercepted by the front horse's quirk, hitting a wall of solid air and falling onto a second platform he'd created just after the first. Just as the other team started to move, Izuku lowered his arm and pulled the quad blaster's trigger, shooting out another net that again covered the rider and head of the front horse. Next, unfortunately, came the moment of truth. With Shinso's and Kirikyu's words echoing through his mind, Izuku said, "Kirikyu, I'm going to take your quirk." As he nodded, Izuku leaned down, put a hand on his head, and forced his quirk to activate. "Get me right under the headbands." Inhaling deeply as he raised up, Izuku aimed his breath at the air that was keeping the headbands suspended. A layer of frost covered it and spread until the air itself was ice. Freezing it into a brittle sheet that shattered, Izuku reached up and jabbed the quad blaster through it. The headbands fell into his left hand, and Izuku apologized to Hatsum as he dropped the now useless gun to the ground. He fastened the headbands around his neck. Before the front horse could make another air bubble, Kirikyu directed the team away. They started off again, heading away from the other teams in the area. They moved to the outer edge of the field, stopping when they reached a portion of the field that was free from any other team. With their backs meters from the line that determined what was in and out of bounds, they could focus on what was in front of them or to their sides. "I'm sorry," Izuku said, reaching down again to return Kirikyu's quirk. "I said it was fine," Kirikyu said. Izuku forced down another apology for irritating him, knowing it would merely exacerbate the issue. But he still couldn't quite grasp why Kirikyu was irritated. Was it not better for Izuku to make his remorse obvious, even if Kirikyu had given him permission to use his quirk on him? Was it not better than taking his quirk without asking? After all, when was using his quirk ever something that could be done without an apology to dispel at least some idea of evil intentions? Shaking his head, Izuku checked the scoreboard and relayed to his team. 3.5 minutes left. "We're in 4th place now." Bakugo had finally bested Todoroki's team, who now sat in one of the last places with 0 points. Todoroki's team had moved closer to Izuku's team, where they were now battling Teeth Boy's team, who must have earned some points back after losing them to Izuku's team. Just before Izuku turned his head, he heard someone on Todoroki's team shout, 1.3 million volts. A boy with electric blonde hair shot out a wave of electricity while the others disappeared under what Izuku assumed was an insulation sheet. Could one of their teammates create objects? The wave hit the other team and shocked them to a standstill, and the boy smirked as his team charged forward. Bakugo's team, on the other hand, was on the same side of the field he'd always been on, much closer to Izuku's team than before. So we just need to defend until time runs out, Kirikyu said. Slightly to their left and a quarter of the way across the field, Bakugo leapt off the supporting hands of his team's horses and into the air. He propelled himself with his explosions to a four-person team that Izuku didn't recognize. He landed on the front horse's shoulders, swatted away the rider's hands with a smoking palm, grabbed the two headbands around the girl's neck, and blasted himself backwards. One of the horses on his team pointed his elbow at Bakugo's back. He shot out a piece of tape from the part of his forearm just above the elbow and pulled Bakugo back to safety. Izuku could assume that was what Bakugo would do to them. So it would be even more personal than he'd originally expected. Well, his plan should still work. Nothing had really changed. As Bakugo added another two headbands to the already impressive pile around his neck, he flicked his gaze sideways and met Izuku's eyes. With their eyes connected, he raised a hand, let an explosion burst to life on his palm, and bared his teeth in a smile. "Bakugo's coming," Izuku said shakily, then cursed himself for how pathetic he sounded. "Not just him," Shinso said. To their left was a boy with 6 arms connected with fleshy webbing and a blue mask covering the bottom half of his face. His arms were positioned behind him to cover his back, where at least one other person had to be hiding. He picked up his speed, sprinting towards them at an incredible pace. In a flash, something pink shot out from the opening between his arms, and Izuku barely had time to flinch before the iron spider's spider legs darted out to meet it. They knocked it to the side, where it hesitated a second before it disappeared back into the darkness between Webbed Arm Boy's arms. When it reappeared, the iron spider met it above Izuku's head, where it wrapped around one of its spider legs. It was a tongue, coated in a thin but shiny layer of saliva that dripped onto the metal of the iron spider. So the person or one of them under Webbed Arm Boy's arms had a quirk that made their tongue long. Most likely an animal-related quirk. A chameleon or frog. The tongue pulled at the spider leg it had wrapped around. Izuku nearly toppled forwards as the pack jerked upwards. If it kept pulling, Izuku would fall, and his team certainly wouldn't have time to fix their formation with Bakugo's team already closing in on them. So Izuku shrugged the pack off, letting the tongue pull it over his head and toss it aside. It hit the ground with a crunch, and Izuku grimaced and apologized at the sound of Hatsume's pained cry. "We should move," Izuku said, eyes flicking between Webbed Arm Boy and Bakugo. "Can't. Foot stuck," Shinso said. From his angle, Izuku couldn't see what had trapped Shinso's foot, so he tried to locate the source of whatever it was. Bakugo's team was still too far to have been responsible. The only other team targeting them was Webbed Arm Boy's, so there must be another person under his arms who had done it. When Webbed Arm Boy was close enough to touch Kirikyu or Hatsume in a few more long strides, Kirikyu let out another icy breath, this one seemingly more powerful than his last. At the same time, Shinso shouted at Webbed Arm Boy. He didn't respond. Instead, he switched directions to circle around Izuku's team's front, dodging Kirikyu's attack entirely. As he turned, he dropped his right arm. The same tongue shot out before Izuku could see who'd been revealed. It wrapped around his arm and jerked it back, and when Izuku was forced to put his other hand out to keep himself from falling, he heard the velcro of the headbands around his neck tear. Before he could grab the headbands back, the tongue had curled around them and had pulled them back to the safety of Webbed Arm Boy's back. Tongue person hadn't taken all of his headbands, but she had taken enough. On the scoreboard, Izuku's team dropped from 4th to 5th, and as Webbed Army Boy escaped, Present Mic announced that they had 2 minutes remaining. Bakugo's team was close now. And as Izuku forced his fingernails into the soft flesh of his palms, Bakugo launched himself into the air. Izuku's arms froze out in front of him, nowhere near his neck where they could protect the headbands they still had left. If he tried to defend himself, Bakugo wouldn't be happy. He did nothing but watch as Bakugo landed on Kiriku's shoulders and grabbed the headbands around his neck. Though Bakugo couldn't use his quirk to purposely harm him as per the rules of the game, Izuku waited for his flesh to. It came in a burst on his collarbone, where Bakugo planted a burning hand to help push him backwards. Again, one of the back horses pulled Bakugo back to his team. The 3 horses caught him and repositioned him to stand on their hands. When Bakugo regained his balance, he let out a sharp laugh and shouted, "Did you really think I'd let you cheat your way into the next round, Deku? You shouldn't have even made it this far." Izuku bit the inside of his cheek until he could feel blood on his tongue. He'd come up with a plan, and for what? Kiriku tried to breathe out another icy breath at the front horse's feet. This breath was weak, however, and it dissipated into the air before it ever reached the red-haired boy. From the press box above, Present Mic announced only 1 minute remained. "How about giving those back?" Shinso called out to Bakugo. Bakugo didn't even spare Shinso a glance. Instead, he watched the scoreboard with a grin. On the screen, Izuku's team had dropped from 5th to 7th, the first in a list of teams with 0 points. It couldn't end like this. Not when their victory had been so close. Certainly not when Shinso hadn't gotten the chance to make a name for himself yet, and not when Kiriku hadn't been able to prove that General Corps students could stand up to Hero Corps students, and not when Hatsum hadn't been able to show off all of her inventions. All 3 of them deserved to move on to the next round, and if Izuku could be the one to give that to them, he would. And he could. He'd face Bakugo's wrath later, but that would be all right. "Everyone, get close to them," Izuku shouted, and his team hesitated for half a second before they were charging at Bakugo's team. Without any warning, which he certainly felt sorry about, Izuku twisted around and slapped Shinso across the face. Raising up to meet Bakugo's stare, he said in a trembling shout, "Bakugo, you're going to lose." "What did you just?" "Throw the 10 million point headband to me," Izuku said. Bakugo followed his instructions with sluggish movements. His teammates shouted at him, but the headbands sailed through the air all the same. Izuku caught it in both hands, clinging to the thin fabric with all the strength he had left in him. With shaking hands, he wrapped the band around the back of his neck and pressed the Velcro strips together. And then the buzzers sounded across the stadium. And Present Mic announced the end of the round. And Izuku stared up at the press box with disbelieving eyes. That is, until Hatsum let out a cheer and let go of Izuku's foot. He plummeted gracelessly to the ground. And there we have it, folks. What an upset. Present Mic cheered, and Izuku heard Eraserhead groan into his microphone beside him. Just barely managing to make up for the points they lost, Team Midoriya takes first place. In second place is Team Bakugo, in third is Team Todoroki, and in fourth is Team Minoma. Congrats, listeners. Unfortunately, Izuku hadn't had time to call for Bakugo to throw the rest of their headbands. But this would do. Izuku immediately turned to Shinso. "I'm so sorry for taking your quirk. And for slapping you," he hurried. "But he didn't respond to you, and I knew he wasn't going to, but I knew he'd respond if I said something, and I couldn't reach your arm. We didn't have much time left, but I didn't even ask first," he trailed off, his voice getting quieter until he was muttering under his breath with a frown that would leave his eyebrows hurting if he kept it up. "Es fine. Did hurt though." Izuku cringed, stuttering out another apology. "Kidding. Barely felt it." He gave Shinso a skeptical look for his horrible joke, but eventually he dropped it. After warning him, Izuku transferred Shinso's quirk back to him. "I really wasn't expecting us to win, but now I'm pleasantly surprised." "Good job, Midoriya," Kiriku said. "What the hell was that, Deku?" Bakugo snarled. When Izuku turned slowly around to face him, he stormed up to Izuku with his teeth bared. His palms were smoking, and Izuku instinctively stiffened. When his mind snapped into action, he didn't change his position. He stayed where he was, tilting his head back when Bakugo grabbed his shirt collar, fully aware that letting his fear show would aid him. Most of the time, the best escape was to accept whatever burns Bakugo decided he deserved that day. Still an escape, though, because it would always be worse if Izuku tried something that Bakugo didn't like. And Bakugo didn't like much. But occasionally, Bakugo would go too far, leaving too many new scars at once. In those cases, it was better to tell him to stop. A stuttered-out warning that he wouldn't be able to move the next day was enough to get Bakugo to back away. After all, he would prefer Izuku's mother be left in the dark. So he stayed frozen as smoke filled his nostrils and his mind supplied him with the stench of burning flesh despite Bakugo having not yet used his quirk on him. Bakugo's voice was somehow even harsher when he asked, "What did you do to me?" If Izuku didn't respond, Bakugo would grow angrier, so Izuku forced out, "What you?" "It was Shinso's." "No, I don't fing play with me." "What did you do?" "Borrowed my quirk," Shinso answered, voice cold and sharp. "And that is not your business," Shinso said. His hair blocked the sun and cast a shadow over his eyes that made the bruises under them even more prominent. Bakugo barked a laugh and leaned in closer, though he had to tilt his head up slightly to keep meeting Shinso's eyes. "I think it is my business, since Deku used it on me." Shinso raised an eyebrow. "Too bad." Shinso could only challenge Bakugo because he didn't understand. But if he wasn't careful, he would understand, and it would be because he was trying to defend someone who'd nearly cost him his future for his own selfish reasons. Why was he even defending Izuku after all he had done? Izuku wanted to take a step in their direction, to stop Shinso from incurring Bakugo's wrath, because Shinso was about to walk away with the same kind of burns that were forever stamped onto Izuku's skin. So Izuku urged his body to move, using every ounce of strength he had left, to put himself between them. He would much rather take one more burn than let Bakugo put a first on Shinso's skin. "You want to fight? You want to be disqualified?" Bakugo scoffed, glancing up at present Mike and Eraserhead in the press box. "Try not to lose before I can kill you myself." Shoving his hands in his pockets, he shot another glare at Izuku before stomping back to his teammates. Shinso watched him go and muttered, "A hole." Izuku dropped to his knees, oblivious to the pain, and rested a hand on his collarbone. His shirt was burned, the edges of the hole that Bakugo had created gnarled and paper-thin between his fingertips. The hole was small, luckily, but he could feel how twisted and waxy his skin was behind the tear. It was a first-degree burn, though he could tell it didn't hurt as much as usual. Still, as long as a teacher didn't notice, nobody could send Izuku to Recovery Girl's office, where she'd likely ask him to take his shirt off. "All right?" Shinso asked. He had crouched down, balancing on his toes and resting his arms on his knees. "Useless?" Izuku laughed humorlessly, covering his face with his hands but spreading his fingers to keep from blocking his vision. "It's his nickname for me." Shinso stayed silent for a while, clearly waiting for Izuku to explain further, but Izuku didn't budge. So he sighed and said, "I need TC Recovery Girl." Izuku shook his head furiously. This time, Recovery Girl wouldn't merely take his word for being bruised all over as she'd done the day before. No, she'd asked to see his chest, where the other dozen or two burn scars laid, where the cuts on his shoulders were laid next to his newest burn. "I'm all right. It barely hurts. Besides, if I go see her now, I won't have any energy for the third round." Shinso stared at him until he squirmed. But still Izuku refused to give in. He couldn't give in not for this. So, instead, Izuku distracted him with, Are we okay?" "What?" "I could have taken her quirk. The purple-haired girl. And before that." "So?" Shinso asked. "One cause of your quirk. Are you sure that's enough?" Shinso rubbed the back of his neck. "I won't push you. Don't know your past." Subtly, Izuku rubbed one of the older burn scars along his hip, the one that tingled the most. All of his scars were tingling, burning as if softly mimicking the pain they had caused him when Bakugo had created them. But that one was the worst. It was the largest one he had, the only one shaped like a handprint. It was only a second degree, he didn't have any third degrees, thankfully, but it was the most gruesome. He couldn't remember when or where he had gotten it, or what he had done to deserve it. But he remembered the smell of his flesh burning. I thank you." "I'll listen," Shinso said. "If why tell me?" Izuku did nothing but shake his head, and Shinso took that as his answer.